Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Welcome to this episode of The Murder Part. Tonight we'll be looking at the case of Rod Ferrell. So I'll start by introducing my co-host. We'll start with you, Jeff. How you doing?
Very good. Glad to be here today. So my name is Jeff Pincin, and I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor in the state of Delaware and Pennsylvania. And I specialize in OCD disorders and anxiety disorders. And if I was not a counselor, or if I had chosen a different career path, what I really had in mind was a Bible Belt salesman. Okay, now you think of the Bible Belt, and it always confused me, like, is this a physical place? Is this like something you can identify on the map? So I figure, why don't I just simplify it, make a belt out of Bibles, and be a Bible Belt salesman? And that way nobody has to guess what exactly the Bible Belt is. That sound reasonable?
Sounds like a reasonable idea.
All right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Turns out I don't know anything about designing, producing, manufacturing, business, or anything. So it was a terrible career choice. So instead, I had to settle for counseling.
Oh, such a great idea, but then just like stymied by reality.
Right. Terrible, right?
It's tough.
I appreciate the support,
Tough.
guys.
Yeah. It's awful.
All right, we'll move to Mike Smith. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing pretty well. My name's Mike Smith. I also am a licensed professional counselor of mental health here in Delaware. My specialization is in narrative therapy and geek therapy. I'm a self-styled expert in all things geek. And if I had not become a counselor, I think what I really wanted to do in my early 20s was just run a Howard Johnson's. Like Howard Johnson's a great place, like motel, restaurant, kind of great deal put together. But I went a different route. I went into Blockbuster instead, and now neither one of those places exists anymore. So forever denied the dream of running a Hojo's.
Maybe you can bring them back.
Yeah, maybe it's possible. But I had to settle for becoming a counselor and helping people with their mental health stuff.
Oh, what a step down.
Yeah,
Wow.
It's terrible.
Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, I always liked Howard Johnson's because they had the orange roof. Kind of a bold statement.
Yeah. And the green pillar in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You don't see that
was great.
Too much, like a pumpkin. Yeah. All right, so this case, of course, this is episode of The Murder Part. This just as easily could have been alien, lizard, humanoids, because
could have been.
This is a really unusual case that it's very tragic and sad. Right? It really is terrible and sad. At the same time, just difficult to comprehend how this even happened because it's so bizarre. It's a case that when you first start looking at, like so many, just looks pretty straightforward. And then you get into the whole backstory with the vampires and the role-playing games. And it just, you kind of see what happened a little more clearly, but then also kind of wonder, how did it happen when so many people invest in these different ideas and don't go and murder people?
That's one of the things that drew me to this case years and years ago. Started following this case because of the role-playing game connection. Like this is a game I'm intimately familiar with. I've played this game quite a bit in my early 20s. And, it's something I really enjoyed. I really liked. And then I heard like, oh, this dude, thought, he went down and killed some people. I was like, what? No way.
So the name of the game is Vampire the Masquerade.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that? Because I don't know anything about the game.
So the game is it's a role-playing game. It's a make-believe, adult make-believe. One of the earliest iterations of role-playing games in this vein is Dungeons & Dragons, invented back in the 70s by Gary Gygax and his friends. Gave people an excuse to kind of play in a fantasy world. Vampire the Masquerade was first written, I believe it was 1993. It's a game designed for allow players to play as vampires, creatures of the night. The masquerade is a reference to the idea that vampires have to try and blend in to humanity because there's billions of humans and only, several million vampires all over the world. And in any given city, there might be a couple of thousand. New York, there's, 8 million people, there might be 8,000 vampires. Heavily outnumbered. Mm-hmm. So in order to maintain the safety of everyone, you have to try and blend in. But at the same time, you are a vampire, and you have to find and feed on mortals, but keep it secret. And there's a lot of stuff about politics, vampiric politics, incredibly long-lived. what do you do with your time? Holding grudges is something that's very easy for vampires to do. So there's a lot of stuff about the politics of manipulation and give and take. There's a lot of lore involved in the game to help people to get into the characters and get into it. And the idea behind role-playing game is to create a character, a new persona, and put yourself in that fantasy world. And this was always supposed to be a fantasy world. In this particular case, it went too far.
Yeah, they definitely, I think, blurred some lines. I mean, but still, I think when people look at a case like this, they hear about, what was this called, Vampire the Masquerade, the game? I mean, it seems relatively benign, but if you were to say somebody played Pac-Man and went out and tried to kill people, I think people would be more surprised. Like, there's something about vampires that seems dangerous, and you can kind of picture more easily how someone could cross over, again, in an area where they shouldn't cross over at all, because it's still a game, but it's a game with a kind of a violent connotation in that vampires kill or transform people or whatever they do. I guess they kill and transform. So
the interesting thing in the game is actually, as a vampire, you're supposed to do everything you can to avoid killing.
But you have to eat, right?
Yeah, you do. But that's the point is, like, you can feed partially off of someone. You don't have to drain someone completely of blood. You can take a little bit from a dozen different people and be sated. But you don't have to kill someone. Because if you go around killing every single person you bite, then pretty soon people are going to look like, what? A lot of people dying around that dude over there.
People are going to be loading up cartridges with silver bullets, right?
Yeah. Right.
Now, there was a movie I really liked. I think it was largely not liked by a lot of people, but it was Tom Cruise, like Brad Pitt, and I forget the guy who played the reporter. He got arrested once in an airport carrying a 9mm.
Interview with a Vampire.
Yeah, Interview with the Vampire. Who was the Christian Slater?
Christian Slater.
Yeah. I remember he got arrested for carrying a gun. I remember. He was in another movie with an armored car, too. It was underwater or something. He's been in a lot of movies. And, of course, Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise have been in a ton of movies.
Kirsten Dunst's first movie.
Oh, was it?
Yep.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
So Tom...
She got to kiss Brad Pitt in her first movie. And she was like 9 or something. Like she was really young. Yeah.
Oh, a child actress.
Yeah, she was a child actress then.
So my favorite character is Lestat, that was Tom Cruise's character, because he was so vindictive and narcissistic and just an unlikable vampire. And you thought, this is what vampires must be like. They must be like walking around with this attitude all the time. And I thought he did a great job. And I think it was it in a movie, so spoiler alert for old movie Vampire Chronicles. But wasn't it something to do with, like, Brad Pitt was a reluctant vampire?
Yeah, he didn't want to be a vampire.
So he would eat, like...
He started out just trying to eat rats.
Right.
He's trying to drain the blood out of rats, trying not to engage that way, because he didn't want to be like Lestat.
Yeah. But it was tough, right? Because there's something more satisfying about a person over a rodent. Yeah.
I could understand the acting was probably good, but I just don't see any appeal for that movie.
It definitely had a niche market, but it was based on a book, Interview with the Vampire, written by Anne Rice, which actually was one of the literary influences on Vampire the Masquerade, because it was written beforehand. In all of the publisher of Vampire the Masquerade is called White Wolf. All of the White Wolf games, which are based on different types of supernatural creatures, like there's a werewolf game and a mage game where you can be a mage, and changelings, fae type creatures, and a few other games. But in every single one of those books, they're like, check out these movies and books as influences on this particular type of genre. Like what influences you might see. They list things like Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles books, the Lestat books, Blade, the movie Blade.
With Wesley Snipes?
Yeah, with Wesley Snipes. They reference that as kind of influence. And I think that's in one of the later editions, because I don't think Blade was out when the first edition was put in it, but that did end up getting included as influence, because they want people to immerse themselves in what this world might be like through literature and movies and things.
We've talked about Anne Rice before, I think on one of the episodes, but just her influence on the world of true crime and how big she is in that world. So that's been an interesting connection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I thought a good movie. I thought it really had good direction and good cinematography. The set design was not cheap. Like you could tell they spent some money.
Yeah, they did.
And big name stars, I know people often don't like them, but they get big name often for a reason. And Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt in particular, I don't think so much Christian Slater, but those two are really talented.
If I remember correctly, Antonio Banderas was in the movie as well.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of early in his...
Yeah.
He played Armand.
He's actually a pretty good actor.
Yeah.
I think he married Melanie Griffith at one point.
Right? I don't remember.
I think he did. Yeah. I think Antonio Banderas married Melanie Griffith. They might still be married.
I usually don't pay attention to the celebrity marriages so much as like what they've been in, the movies that they're in.
Well, he was in a very popular movie where it was like a gunfight in Mexico.
Oh, yeah. Desperado.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where he...
Which is a sequel to El Mariachi, which is actually a really low-budget movie. It was made for several thousand US dollars in Mexico. Really, really cheaply. Robert Rodriguez's first movie.
Okay.
Which was really great. And they refilmed some actual scenes from that movie for Desperado.
Oh, how about that? Yeah. I thought that was good. And I think he was also a cat in Shrek, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He was Puss in Boots.
That's right. He had the big eyes.
Yeah.
Puss in Boots.
All right. So back from that tangent, back to Rod Ferrell. So what does this have to do with Rod Ferrell? Well, Rod Ferrell was very into vampires. That was his thing. And we'll kind of get through as we go through the timeline how involved he became. But he kind of built his own little movie, right? He got his own little crew there and actors and played out a whole bizarre story.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, in 2002, a Hollywood movie actually was made about this whole case. It's called Vampire Clan. It's a terrible movie. It's really low budget. It's terrible, but it was based on this case.
Which seems appropriate given Rod Ferrell's personality, right?
Yeah. Then everything surrounding this was very low budget.
That kind of fits with vampires, though, like that it's underground, not really what you were saying, Mike, with the game, how you're trying to fit in with people. Like, it's not a real, let me come out and just say I'm a vampire and let everybody know. And, of course they would do that, Rod Ferrell and his clan, his people. But it's not something that's, like, socially acceptable, right? So underground type things, low budget type things, that seems to fit in with it.
For games like Vampire the Masquerade, it very much drew in the crowd of the disaffected youth,
Mm-hmm.
Who might in other areas be punk, or in other ways like goth. Kind of drew them in.
Countercultural.
Counterculture types from the early '90s. The counterculture of the early '90s was definitely into this kind of thing, and I was too.
Well, you see what the dressing in black and stuff we'll talk about, which vampires would not necessarily do.
No.
Lestat didn't, I don't think, did he?
He dressed primarily in bright primary colors.
He was colorful, yeah.
In one of the other books, he's actually a rock star. So,
well, because he lived for a long...
Yeah, very, very long time.
Yeah. So, speaking of living, Rod Ferrell was born in 1980. We see it was in Murray, Kentucky, apparently not far from Tennessee. Both his parents, Rick Ferrell and Sandra Gibson, were 17 years old when he was born. Usually this is not a great sign,
right?
Although, things can work out, but it's one of those things that kind of is cumulative, and you think, okay, that's pretty young to be having a child. They tried to make a living together, but they made it about a month, so that didn't go as planned. Ferrell was raised mostly by his mother. They lived with her parents much of the time. So his mother was an exotic dancer and a sex worker, and she actually had the initial interest in fantasy role-playing games and vampires. Mm-hmm. She was very into that game.
She introduced Rod to Vampire the Masquerade. That's one of the reasons that he kind of got so interested in it, because it was something he shared with his mother, which he didn't have a lot of. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you figure 17-year age difference, usually when people think of a generation, they think 20 to 25 years.
Yeah. This
is somebody who, I think there was boundaries that got enmeshed, that got crossed in there where they interacted more like siblings.
Yeah, especially since they were living with her parents.
Right.
So
they take the parent role.
Yeah, they take the parent role still their kid, even though she's technically an adult, but they're still treating her as if she's a kid. And, he gets to see that. And then he's, they're obviously watching him and taking care of him as well. So he gets treated, basically it is like a sibling relationship at that point. And if he doesn't get much time to spend with her, any time he does get to spend during his formative years becomes very implanted, but very, very diffuse boundaries, I'm sure.
And she's doing a lot of growing up at the same time that he is, being 17 when he's born and not having a lot of life experience and already being kind of behind the curve, because being a sex worker, it's not like there's a whole lot of... it's not like that's something that's really looked positively upon by many people. So she's already kind of down one on that one. And being a teenager when she's giving birth to her first child and now being a single parent. So she's got a lot of growing up to do while she's trying to help her son grow up at the same time. And of course, that plays into the role of her parents and them parenting her and Rod seeing that, like you guys were just saying. So it's a recipe for a lot of things that could really go wrong and could really go against Mom and Rod as well.
Yeah, it also seems like she's very, very immature. Mm-hmm. That's a theme that we see repeatedly. Right. Not that Rod was ahead of his time by any measure, but Sandra was really, I think she lived a teenage life the whole time this is going on. Yeah. I don't think there was a time where she really acted like an adult.
Yeah.
So in 1990, Rod Ferrell's grandparents bought a house in Eustis, Florida, and Rod moved there to Kentucky, from Kentucky to Florida temporarily, made some friends in Florida. This becomes important later in the story. He missed them when he moved back to Kentucky. One of those friends was a 15-year-old named Heather Wendorf. Mm-hmm. She complained, like many 15-year-olds do, that her parents were terrible. Just wanted to be free.
Yeah.
She very much bought into which as a result, she very much bought into the counterculture kind of stuff we were just talking about, and really kind of had this thought in her mind that, I hate my parents, I hate their rules, I hate living here, I hate all this stuff. So let me kind of go against the grain. Let me do something different here. And so it's kind of an easy association going into some of the things that we'll talk about with Rod and what he got into.
Right. Like when she was in high school, she wore like the black tights that had been ripped up and shredded, and purple hair, and she had a black backpack, and hanging from that backpack, she had a Barbie doll hanging from a noose, like it had its neck in a noose. Like that was kind of the counterculture stuff she was trying to portray, which fit really into the where Rod was as well, like his mentality.
Yeah. So Rod moves back to Kentucky. Again, missing the people in Florida. Now he's going to start 10th grade. He doesn't do well in school. School's a real challenge. So he starts calling Heather Wendorf. And the phone bills get so expensive that Rod's mother simply can't afford it. Right. Now keep in mind, look at the mechanism. They get so expensive she can't afford it, not she stopped him from calling. Like no parenting's going on. Mm-hmm.
Right.
So the phone actually got cut off. And back then, and we described this a few times, back in the olden times, phones were associated with an address, not somebody's pocket.
Right. There was an actual wire that went into the house and then connected to that phone.
You mean to the stone tablet?
Yeah. Well,
right.
Yeah.
You put the tablet up to your ear.
Right.
Sometimes they were as heavy as stone tablets. Jeez.
And sometimes you just use a cup that had a string between it. That was the only way.
That was if you didn't want to have the call waiting.
Or somebody else wanted to use the phone, right?
Or somebody else wanted to use the phone. Sometimes the phone line's actually used for the internet too. Like back in those days, you had a thing called a modem, which hooked into
that's right.
the phone line.
So if you're dialing into AOL, you couldn't be on the phone.
Right.
If somebody picked up, it messed up your connection.
It did.
And now everyone's trying to picture listen for what that sounded like when you heard AOL dialing or the internet service dialing.
Oh yeah.
We all got have that sound in our mind right now.
If you're over a certain age, you definitely know what that sound is.
Yeah.
The data tone from modem.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys remember this, but I had several of the early computers that were made for consumers that I think my first one was a Timex Sinclair. It had 16 kilobytes.
Nice.
That was the total memory.
Nice.
And that was with an expansion. It actually came with 2 kilobytes. And you had to get this huge expansion pack that was like, I don't know, $50 or something.
I know my first was an Apple IIe, so
A little more modern. In the early games, there's this the games that are available for that computer. One was Frogger, which is more modernized now. Mm-hmm. But there was actually, for all these games, there were cassettes. They were like audio cassettes. Mm-hmm. They would make that screaming, screeching noise if you try to play them, and you'd load them onto the computer with a tape recorder. You'd hit play, and that's how it.
Wow.
Yeah, there was no floppy disk.
Yeah, it was reading the data
That's
tone.
impressive.
That's what it was.
Yeah, when I bought my first 5 1/4 floppy disk, which was the old style, it was $200 for that machine. And within a few years, it was worth nothing because the 3-inch, whatever they are, the smaller ones came out, and of course years later the CDs and all that. But
completely different topic. I did want to say I just looked at it, and Vampire the Masquerade wasn't first published in '93; it was '91. But Rod and Heather met in 1990, and they would talk and distance talk and everything. But it was in that time period when the game came out, and his mom would become interested in it.
she was interested in other games before that.
Yeah, she was interested in other games before that, because there were still many between the late 1970s and the early 1990s. There were many role playing games that came out.
Yeah, so they were consuming a lot of these different products, getting into this lifestyle. Now, so the phone line was cut off. So Heather started calling collect, which I guess they were still able to do. I don't know. But then her father cut her off. Then he started writing letters. So they stayed in touch, even though they lost voice communication.
To your point, Dr. Grande, about the parenting, cutting off the child versus, this is getting too expensive. Seems, and I don't exactly know how that happened between the two families, but it sounds very different. I'm cutting you off from this. I'm parenting you. I'm disciplining you, versus this is just getting too expensive. I can't handle how expensive this is. So it seems very different approach.
Yeah, interestingly, what you read about the Wendorfs, we'll get to the parents in a bit. They meet an unfortunate end. But
spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert, there's murder in the murder part. But we know that Heather had an older sister. I think she was 2 years older.
Jennifer.
She worked at a Publix supermarket and had a boyfriend not far from there. She seemed relatively normal, and the parents seemed normal and appropriate. It was Heather that was a little unusual in the mix there. So I could see the Wendorfs saying, no, you're not going to continue this calling behavior.
Right.
But they probably didn't know that she would start writing. Yeah, that's a little unusual. I mean, usually when a teenager gets cut off from something like that, they're not going to go to writing letters. This isn't like email. Right? These are handwritten letters.
Well, email wasn't quite what email is now back then either. So it was like you either talk on the phone or send a letter. And I think if they had known about email,
they
or
would have
been able to, like
chatting, or
they would have really gone there. But in 1991 time, and computer, the internet wasn't huge. Right?
Yeah, it wasn't really. It didn't become to where a lot of people saw it until like 95. 95 is when a lot of people sent their first email. Yeah. And really AOL was the big provider at that time. I think pretty much like 90-something% of the market in the United States. And again, dial-up, horribly slow.
Yeah.
Horrible. Yeah. And nothing was optimized. Websites were clunky and didn't work very often. Like it was still actually a really exciting time. I remember the first computer I had, and I think it was in 94. I think I got the first like real computer, like that would connect to the internet, and it was was it a DX? Something like that. 186, 286 DX. I forget, but they have these designations that now are like, they're all like antiquated.
Right.
This is like pre-Pentium.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, 95 was when Windows 95 came out, which had a huge impact on computing in general as part of the culture. And before that, Windows 3, I used to have
3.1.
a machine that ran Windows 3.1, and it was okay.
It wasn't a bad product.
It wasn't a bad product, but Windows 95, like it blew everything away. Like the GUI that you got to use, the general user interface, the graphic user interface, just made it easier to do things, and people really liked it. And so people started using computers more, and if you're going to use computers more, it just makes sense to use the internet more.
Yeah, and some of the early games were very primitive, but like by today's standards, but by those standards, they were like incredible.
Yeah.
Like, it was just
Like nothing you'd ever seen.
now you could run them on like a wristwatch, like but back then they were like huge downloads with a slow AOL, or you have to buy the discs and like a pack of like 20 of them and load them one at a time and yeah, much better these days with like everything's online. You can download everything and pretty much I don't think people buy DVDs and stuff now with games on them.
Probably some
they
people.
have them, but most of the time it's streamed
Yeah.
through like Steam or another service like that, or you just go directly to the website and download their installer and install.
Yeah. Well, the updates are easier that way.
Yeah. I mean, if you're playing on consoles, there's still discs for disc consoles, but the next gen systems, PS5, Xbox One X, they're trying to move to a digital only system as well.
It makes sense because you can buy a new computer and then re-download all your stuff from Steam and not have to mess around with like, where's that key from this?
Oh, yeah, the product keys.
You get a Sharpie and you write the key, everywhere,
You have a whole closet full of boxes and had keys in
You
it.
get a new computer and you've got to go back to all of your old games and find the product key postcard just so you can play the game again. Oh man.
Yeah.
So
It was a magical time despite all those limitations.
Oh, it's so terrible. But they were writing letters to each other probably because they didn't have email.
Yeah, and they kept doing this, and we see that Ferrell went to New Orleans with his grandparents, and this trip really made an impression on him. And New Orleans has a tradition around death, like there's a cultural element, like Mardi Gras and things. Or Mardi Gras is not their big thing with death, though. There's like another event they do.
New Orleans funerals,
Yeah.
are huge. Like they're very somber in the church, but they transfer from the church to the graveyard is a parade.
Yeah.
They have a lot of lively music, a lot of jazz music, and then once they get usually when they get to the graveyard, it becomes kind of more somber music as they lay the person to rest. But it's always supposed to be a celebration of a person's life, not the passing that's gone on.
Which is a bit more common around the world than it is in the U.S. I think I don't know if we're the outliers, not necessarily the outliers, but I think it's much more common around the world to have more of a celebratory tone than it is in the U.S. to have more of just a somber tone throughout, but rather having parades or having music or having more upbeat kind of, let's celebrate this person.
Yeah, so I think when you take that kind of like this colorful, animated view to like funerals, then with something like Mardi Gras and other traditions where you have like a lot of masks and things like that, to somebody who's, I think, prone to misinterpreting cultural elements, Ferrell probably interpreted this as dark and vampire-like and death-oriented.
Feel like he fit right in there. Like, these people love death too. This is great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so when he went back to Kentucky, he was a whole new, I wouldn't say man, I guess whatever he was. Was he 18 by that point? I'm not even sure.
Yeah.
No,
because he wasn't even 18
wasn't
by the
even-
time he
yeah.
committed the murders.
Yeah, so
I think
a whole new teenager.
He was 14. He was 15 or 16.
Whole new teenager.
He was a whole new teen. Yeah.
He was self-confident. He claimed he had martial arts talents. He started dressing in all black, and he re-identified as a 500-year-old vampire.
Yeah. Visago, I believe was the name. Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, Matt, go
No, go ahead.
One of the things that struck me about this was living in Kentucky, right? So they're in the Bible Belt, which, I mean, lucky them. That'd be a great place to sell Bible belts, I would think.
Would have been. It would have been.
Could have been.
As I heard one person describe that particular area of Kentucky, it was the buckle.
The buckle of the Bible,
the Bible belt.
Right. Arguably the most important part of the belt.
Yeah. Or the holes, but
Well, I mean, it's a package deal. So yeah, being in the Bible Belt, right? Obviously, you have a lot of churches, right? And the number of churches to people, right, is much different than perhaps other places in the U.S. or in the world. So, I mean, consider how different this is, right? You have this kid that's focused on vampires and death and the story surrounding it, and believing he's these 500-year-old vampire and stuff that is so counter to biblical teachings that, I mean, I'm sure he felt it on a daily basis, that he was just totally like so far away from other people in that community. Now, of course, his mom would be probably viewed in a similar way, being a sex worker, contrary to many of the things that would be biblical teachings. So he got it, he came about it honestly, having beliefs or viewpoints or a way of living that's much different than his surroundings. And so there's probably a lot of those I don't think he struggled with it internally. I think he loved what he believed, but probably a lot of struggles with other people around him and how they viewed him and how people in that community saw what he was doing and was so disapproving. And he was already looked down upon even before he had a chance.
Yeah, he was certainly kind of rebelling, getting bad feedback, and then rebelling more. Right? He was in that cycle.
Yeah.
He did find in the town he lived in Murray, there was a thriving group of people playing Vampire the Masquerade who identified themselves as vampires. Now, there was 15 to 20 people in this group, and they kind of migrated in and out, and they would move around through different people's houses, partying, again, doing things that are outside of the Bible belt buckle norm, right? Murray was a dry town, right? No alcohol.
Right.
And these kids would be drinking nightly and be doing drugs. It was really counterculture to that. They were trying to exercise their freedom and go with this, but they were also playing this game, Vampire the Masquerade. Mm-hmm. And initially, when Rod joined, everyone knew it was a game. And they did do some role-playing elements that were a little bit above and beyond. They were actually sharing transmission of blood, like they were cutting. But in those instances, the very interesting documentary that came out about that time, right after this whole thing, called Kentucky Teenage Vampires. Mm-hmm. It came out in 1998. They actually go and talk to some of the people who were in that group, and especially one of the most important, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he would talk about how cutting, and I've heard this in therapy sessions, exactly this type of things, how like the cutting would release a sense of stress and bring about kind of a wave of pleasure over instead of pain, and help to release. So I mean, he was using, and several of the others were using that aspect of, let's cut, with a razor blade on my arm to release some blood to be a cutting mechanism, which is a very unhealthy coping mechanism. But they were then using that to do the passage of blood from one person to another. And the images of this guy, his arm, were astounding. The number of times that he had cut his arm was just astounding. I think cutting was something I think it's always been with us as far as human beings go. Self-harm, it has been with us for a long time, but it's become much more noticeable in the mental health treatment community in the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, very tied to depression and borderline features.
Yeah. But again, most of the people in this group, even though they were doing those kinds of things, for them they knew it was a game. And kind of like the Blood Brothers thing, like 5-6-year-old like poke their fingers with a thing and press their thumbs against each other, or the Spit Brothers like spit in their hand and shake hands just because it's gross. That's the kind of childish thing, but that's what they were doing. They were kind of live action role playing this stuff, which that's a thing. Live action role playing is a big thing. There's actually even a whole book for Vampire the Masquerade. It's called Mind's Eye Theater. It's the rules for what you're supposed to do in order to live action role play. And the number one rule is don't touch anybody. You're not supposed to actually make physical contact with another person. That's for safety's sake. Mm-hmm. But these kids they obviously hadn't read that book.
Yeah, they were a little impulsive.
And I think that book hadn't come out at that point, but it was still like they were trying to live action role play it. But they still, most of them understood, this is fake. This is make-believe. It's helping us to get things out. But they were engaging in the drinking, drugs,
drug use, yeah.
sex, all the vampire stuff, because that's what vampires are all about. And then Rod comes along. He falls into it real heavy.
Yeah, and he becomes kind of a leader of a bunch of them. At the same time, his performance in school is now not just academically poor. He starts accumulating infractions, 22 in just about 5 months, January to May of 1996. He was expelled and told to come back the next spring semester. So they were pretty upset with him. The official reason for his expulsion: willful disobedience, defiance of school authority, and incorrigible bad conduct. So they really gave him a lot of chances.
And that's tough to do, get 22 infractions in 5 months. Like, you got to be really intentional about that.
Yeah. I think at that point he was being intentional about it. Like, he was...
The average person might, start to realize, all right, I got to cool it down a little bit. Maybe I can still be stupid or whatever, but I got to do something to not get caught. But not in Rod's case. Just, no, I'm going to keep doing whatever I want.
Yeah. Yeah, and he started committing crimes. He got thrown off the school property. He would keep coming back to school. And I guess I'm trying to understand here, I was reading the book on this and other sources. In Kentucky, back then, it sounds like things were a little different, where there was a juvenile court system that you could directly contact to get somebody in trouble, right? So the principal actually went there, it sounds like, instead of the police. But it was still I guess it's more of an adjudication, not really a criminal charge, but they adjudicated the youth. And he was racking up offenses in this system that was supposed to help him.
Right.
But it wasn't punitive. Like the adult system is pretty much exclusively punitive these days. But the juvenile system still had, at that time, some semblance of, we're going to help. It's restorative.
Yeah.
Now it's mostly just non-functioning. Right.
It's a holding pattern until they can be tried as an adult.
Yeah, it's a place to keep them before they get transferred to prison. Yeah. So Ferrell, around this time, started dating a 15-year-old named, one of her names was Charity Cassie. She also had another name. I can't remember it now, but she had two names.
Oh yeah, she went by her character name from the game as well.
But what's weird is even the court documents, they call, or the official reports say Charity Cassie. So I don't know. I don't know what happened there, how she was able to do that, because I think the other name was actually her real name. I thought.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I can't remember it now. So they both participated in this vampire fantasy, and we see that this circle of friends starts to expand, and Ferrell emerges as the leader. Mm-hmm. Now, he was the oldest, 500 years, so.
That comes with a lot of life experience. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that makes sense. Friends would describe him as, at least one said that he was charismatic, he was fun to be around, kind of get the impression that he was likable at some point. Now, of course, he would change pretty dramatically, and other friends would say that they saw a pretty dramatic shift in him. But I imagine that he found people that he really enjoyed being around, people that he felt like he could be himself, right? Really play out a lot of these fantasies or things that he actually believed and feel comfortable doing it. Feel like people that were actually doing the things that he was into. So I imagine that he would really display a certain personality because he really liked being around these people, is my guess. So that would make sense why people would kind of flock to him, why he would become the leader, because I'm sure he felt out of place in many other places.
Yeah, and I think he was the one who was willing to take chances. So like, again, maybe they weren't super criminally oriented, but when teenagers get together, if one's willing to commit a crime, they all are.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
Right.
And he started really pushing boundaries and doing things like I don't know about the other two portions of it, but the McDonald triad, there was some cruelty to animals going on.
Yes. Marked. It was pronounced. Yeah.
There was the one instance, the guy who introduced him to the Masquerade, who had been kind of seen as the leader of the group initially, who he and Rod became very, very good friends. He pulled back after he witnessed Rod kill a kitten, and he was just like, "Whoa!" And he tried to push Rod out of the group, but Rod then started just like bringing more people in and kind of taking over. And then there was an incident with at a local veterinary. I think it was
that was horrible.
Yeah, it was, that was actually
shelter or something.
Yeah, it was an animal shelter. Yeah.
Yeah, they murdered. It was him and another person, I believe, who murdered 2 dogs. And we won't go into the details. It was horrible.
Yeah.
Like it was so horrible that law enforcement had trouble even staying at the scene. And they freed the remainder of the animals, which I guess is problematic because you have animals with varying histories and you're putting them all in the same area.
Right. They only were able to identify 2, but from what one of the investigating officers said, the grass around where they entered the fence was just trampled down as if there were multiple people there, more than just 2. Like it looked like they brought maybe like 5 or 10 people with them, and trampled all of it down. But they were only able to really identify, and I don't think they were really fully identified and charged Ferrell with anything.
No, I don't think he was ever.
As he went to the police about it, and he denied everything.
He claimed he had an alibi. I think his mom gave him an alibi or something. I think they said the animals were mutilated as well.
Yeah,
if I remember correctly.
There was mutilation.
So,
really horrible.
It was horrible.
Not just let me kill an animal, let me mutilate animals.
Yeah, it was sadistic, and we see his antisocial behavior was really increasing during this time. He was adding LSD and cocaine to marijuana and alcohol. He got in trouble in this juvenile court system, and the judge cut him a break. This was before the incident with the dogs, and said, you need to go see a mental health counselor. No threatening to kill people. Submit the drug screens. Be home by 10. He started breaking those rules the second he left the county building or whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And it was not too long after that he killed a kitten. And then, of course, he was attacked. He was attacked by another, like a rival gang member in this incident. And this is in between killing the kitten and the dogs. And then we see that his mother gets in some trouble. Sandra Gibson was arrested for enticing a 14-year-old brother of a guy who beat up Rod Ferrell. Yeah. It's complex. They're all kind of woven together. But she was offering sex and said that basically if he did that, he would become a vampire, which would have been a good thing in their little circle. So she would plead guilty to that crime. And I think there was a more recent interview after all this was over where she was basically trying to defend herself, saying that she tried to be a good mother. I don't see any clear evidence of that, but, we don't know everything. So there might have been moments where she did try.
Well, she was, we said before about how a 17-year-old single mom when Rod was born and all the difficulties that she faced just right from the very beginning. So I'm sure she did feel like she was trying her best. And obviously she was already into some things that were very questionable. Not only her job choice, but also the vampire stuff and maybe beliefs like that. So she was up against a lot to begin with. Not an excuse, of course, right, for being a bad parent, but I'm sure she did feel like she was being a good parent. I'm sure she felt like she was giving it everything that she had, which probably wasn't a lot, but I'm sure she felt like she was putting all of her effort into being a good parent. Not that it had good outcome necessarily, but I'm sure that's what she felt like, and that's why somebody might defend themselves in a situation like that. No, I really did try. I'm sure you did try, but that doesn't mean that it worked out for you.
I guess to be fair to her, there was a point not long before the attack on the dogs where she contacted social services and said that Stephen was going to kill her. Right, that's what led to him getting in trouble and having the curfew he didn't follow. So she was becoming frightened of him.
Yeah.
I mean, Rod.
Yeah, of Rod, right. Yeah, she was. So he was kind of like, the wheels are coming off. He's getting more antisocial, killing animals. His mother's, he threatened to kill his mother. He probably meant it. So he's alienating, the people who could have helped him, even if they weren't good at helping him. Yeah. At least they were something. And
there's also a thing where people, especially women in America, don't want to identify as a bad mom. Like, even if they might feel like it inside, they always defend that I'm a good mom. Mm-hmm. One of the realest moments I've ever had in counseling was I just started working in an inpatient treatment center, And I was shadowing different counselors, and one of the counselors had to do the women's group, which it was on a Saturday, and they split it up. Like men who were 27 and under went to one group, 27 and older or 28 and older went to another group, and then all the women, because they're a smaller group than the men in the rehab, they all went to one group. Right? And I'm sitting there with this other counselor who I'll just call Miss B, and Miss B is kind of like leading the group in just some positive affirmations and things. I was like, okay, well now, who wants to start talking? And the conversation started talking, and one of the women goes like, I'm here. I'm a good mother. And Miss P just started said, no, you're not. And like, there was a realist moment because this girl was like, well, I am a good mother. I was like, no, you're not. You're in rehab. You are not a good mother. You could be a good mother when you're sober, but you're in rehab. You're not a good mother. And that's something like it struck me because that's something you don't say.
Yeah.
Right? You don't tell someone they're a bad parent, even if it's clearly true. Right? You don't tell someone they're a bad parent, even if you've watched them repeatedly beat their child. You go, oh, well, they're trying. Or, I'm just not going to say anything at all. I'm going to go call the police. But I'm still not going to tell a person to their face that they're a bad parent.
I'm going to avoid conflict.
Yeah, I'm going to avoid that conflict. But Miss B just was like, nope, you're a bad mother.
Got to own it.
Got to own it. And realize you can't make the change until you're aware of the change, of what needs to change. And that's just, like I said, that was the realest moment in counseling I'd had at that point, was because it became really true to me. Like, if you're not aware of what needs to change, you can't change it.
Yeah. I think in counseling, I think there's this picture that counselors kind of always go along with the client. And I think part of this is television and movies, where the portrayals of counselors are just ghastly. Like, they couldn't be any worse than they are. Like I watch them, I think, this is nothing like what I would say. Yeah. It's all, I feel like in so many of these different shows, it's all just like reflecting back, how do you feel? How did that make you feel? Well, once you felt that, how'd you feel then? That's not what it's like.
And tell me about your mother.
Yeah, and your childhood. In real life, confrontation is necessary in counseling. And it's harder for newer counselors to do that, but it's a very valuable talent once it's learned, because you can't have people being unrealistic in therapy. If they're drinking too much, you can't be like, oh, I've seen people drink that much before. You'll be fine. No, you won't. It could kill you. Right? It's dangerous. And it's if you're going to do it, you're going to do it, but the client should know the truth.
Yeah.
It actually is something I have talked to a client about. I have said to them, hey, I've seen people who drink that much, and they've been fine. I don't think you're that person, though. And hey, if this is look at all the problems this is causing in your life, and we went through each and every one of them. Like, this is what's causing your problem.
Yeah, I see a lot of counselors get caught in the trap of like harm reduction, which is the name of my book.
Yeah.
But like harm reduction, where when somebody's trying to get off alcohol or any drug, one of the, I'll call it a fantasy that they have, and it occurs almost all the time, is that someday they can use a little. Like, I don't have to stop. Like, I'm drinking 18 beers a day. I can do 2 a day and be fine. Like, I won't go to number 3. I can stop at 2, or I can stop at 1, or I can stop drinking just on the weekend. I can drink. I won't do it during the work week. And some counselors will go along with like, okay, let's go to that point, and you can surely do that. When that's not realistic. You're not going to do that. I've seen people do it 1 in 100.
Yeah, I've had that conversation. I've used the term harm reduction. I'm like, I'm harm reduction. Great. If that's where you want to go, harm reduction is great. If you want to see if you can drink only on the weekends, sure, I'm with you. But I don't think it's going to happen. I'll be honest with them straight up. Be like, I don't think it's going to happen. I think you're going to end up having to go total abstinence. But if we can get you to just drinking on the weekends, great.
Right.
We're awesome. That's the step that's where you want to be. I'm with you. But I don't see it happening.
Yeah. It's not the solution if you really want to be free of addiction, but it will reduce the amount of harm. Right. So it's realism, I think. I think everybody's trying to be careful and politically correct and friendly. That's just nonsense when it comes to therapy. Yeah. Therapists have to be honest.
Yeah.
especially when, like you were saying, Dr. Grande, when you start out, you're thinking, I want this person to come back, right? I want to see this person for another session. So, all the thoughts that run through your mind. Let me be agreeable, but also let me challenge, right? I want to be challenging this person's beliefs and thoughts, but I also want to build rapport with this person, and you're finding that fine line. So you kind of have to find your voice, right? So you shadow other people, you see how other people do it, and then you see someone challenge something, and you're like, oh my God, I would have never done that. And then you realize, wait a minute, like that's the way they do, that's the way that person does things, and that works for them. And sometimes it might not, but they're going to take the chance, realizing that that's in the client's best interest, right? Is that you need to know you're not doing something good right now, and I'm not going to enable your behavior, right? So that's important too. And so it's such a fine line, but the more you do it, I think the more you realize, I just, I need to confront and do so lovingly and in a caring way, when necessary. But I need to be confrontational. I need this person to recognize what they're doing is not conducive to health, a healthy life, a healthy thought process. And that's my job, right? It's my job to make sure this person gets better, or to help in the process, aid them however I can. And enabling, it never does that, right? Or at least rarely, I'm sure. But it's not something you want to err on the side of, let me enable this person, see if it works out. Mm-hmm.
See, I think that's where I had a benefit doing my internship and then the first few years of practice in an inpatient setting, because I didn't have to worry about, is this person going to come back? Like, they're there. Like, they're on my caseload. They're coming back. Like, I don't have a choice. Like, if they didn't come in for the individual session, I just picked up a phone, called a tech, and be like, hey, go find this person and bring them to my office. And I'm done. Like, I don't have to worry about sugarcoating and saying. In fact, my problem was actually the opposite. My problem was telling people, you got to go. You got to get out, right? And it was, I had issues with people who came to me and said, hey, I'm leaving against medical advice. And there was a protocol that we had to go through, and I have to try and talk them into staying for their own good. But it wasn't, I'm afraid this person's not going to come back and see me, which I think is a problem that you hit on right on the head. Like when you're doing internship in a private practice setting or an outpatient setting where people can feel free to not come back next week. That's an issue. But for me, you had to deal with behavioral stuff. Like, this person got caught having sex on campus. Like, they've violated the rules of the campus. They got to go. Mike, you got to tell your client they got to get out. I'm like, how do I do that? That's a confrontation issue. Like, I've got to now separate this person out. I got to risk getting yelled at, screamed at for this. And that was the biggest issue I had with that. So I didn't have that particular issue until I moved into private practice. Yeah. And at that point I was just like, if they don't come back, I get somebody else.
Well, at that point you found your voice, right? And you realize what works and doesn't work for you, and the risk you're willing to take knowing that they might not come back. Well, you know what? That's not my fault. I'm the one, I'm doing my job, right? I'm trying, I have their best interest in mind, whether they want to hear it or not. Yeah. Mike, you bring up a good point, I think, about rapport. And you had to say some pretty abrasive things like, you got to leave. You broke the rules. You need to leave. And that could really affect your rapport with the person. But that's also the rules. They got to follow the rules. You have to enforce them. That's your job. That's your role in this. I worked at a school, 2 different schools where they're alternative schools. And in one of the schools, it was a hands-on school. So we had to do restraints, if necessary for the students. And it's a weird thing, right? Because here I am, a therapist in the building, and for the safety of the student and others around them, you may have to engage in a restraint, a physical restraint of the student. And it's weird, right? It's weird to do that, to have to physically restrain anyone, especially a child or a teenager. And also, in the next 30 minutes or hour or so, you may be in the same office as this student engaging in therapy, right? And it's a weird thing, but it's my job in that moment is to follow the rule, make sure everyone's safe, of course, and still be able to do my job, still be able to maintain whatever rapport with this student and recognize and help them to recognize anything that happened is for your own safety, right? I don't want to get hurt. I don't want you to get hurt. And if you're aggressive, then that's a problem, right? And we need to do something as the staff of this this building. So there's a lot of things we have to do that are strange, right? We have to even billing, right? In private practice, you might have to really go after someone that's not paying, right? And ultimately do some things that aren't comfortable for you, but you agreed to pay me for this, or whatever the structure is. And so now I've got to be kind of the bad guy, but still you agreed to this, and now I have to do something that might hurt our rapport. And so, yeah, you have to engage in a lot of different roles while still being appropriate in your therapeutic techniques and things like that. So it's a very interesting career that we have.
It's interesting you talk about like having to be the bad guy and tell somebody to get out, and building into rapport on that, because there's more than once I had to sit down with one of our frequent flyers and say, okay, you got to go because you broke this rule, that rule, the other rule, and the techs are already getting your stuff. You're going to be out of here. You got to call for a ride, and then like 3 months later, that person comes back through and requested me.
Yeah, right.
As their primary therapist. And it's like, okay, wow, I kicked you out last time. Like, yeah, but you were doing your job. And like the frequent flyers know that. Yeah. And they get it because they realize I did something wrong. It's not Mike's fault that I did this thing.
That's an important part of it.
In that moment, it might have been cursing me out and be like, you son of a effer, blah, 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 blah. And, but that's because at that moment they're being confronted with a boundary, and addiction hates boundaries.
That's a good point.
So I got a lot of crash courses in a lot of different areas. Working inpatient is a great experience, though. And I think that I got to say, thank you for making me do that. As I might have mentioned it before, after our first semester, I had Dr. Jim Walsh was my academic advisor. And he sat me down in the first meeting and kind of broke me down. Because I came into the program, I only had my bachelor's in psychology. I didn't have any experience in working in the field. I didn't have any major mental health issues of my own or in my family. And Dr. Walsh broke me down. And he was like, the last question he asked me was like, what population do you want to work with? And I'm like, I don't know. Anything but addiction. I don't think I can work with addicts. And then, of course, we got to internship year, and we were doing research up at Eagleville, which is a substance use treatment inpatient center. I didn't know that when you sent me up there, and I'm like, oh crap! But it did get me to challenge my biases and challenge everything. And then, of course, I spent the next 2.5 years doing inpatient drug and alcohol abuse, and I loved it.
Yeah, and I think what counselors discover in that setting is that, as they move out of that setting, is that everything's an addiction. So, learning about substances, you learned about the rest of counseling too. Yeah. And not learning about substances, there's a whole piece missing when you go to work with clients. Right.
And then, you see trauma everywhere because in addiction treatment, trauma is everywhere. That was one of the things we found at Eagleville, right? 96% of all of our subjects said yes for trauma.
Trauma is very prevalent. And, huge. Sometimes it would occur before the substances, often, and that would be explain the substances. Other times, unfortunately, the substance use makes you more vulnerable to be a victim or be otherwise traumatized, like a car accident. And now you have co-occurring, right? So,
and often, sometimes it's a matter of trauma didn't happen until substance use was deep, but then the change in substance, like going from oxycodone to heroin, kind of puts you in environments where trauma is more likely to happen. And then invariably it does.
Yeah. Being someone who regularly uses substances, puts people in a position where they're going to get in trouble. Unless you're like a billionaire and,
they still get in trouble. They just get out of it really quickly.
Yeah. You can afford a good lawyer, but you can, when you're wealthy, you can isolate from different threats to some extent. Doesn't always work. But if you're not, you're subject to, being out in the environment, you're going to get in trouble. Yeah. So speaking of trouble, now we move to what Rod Ferrell did here. So again, a lot of substance use. He was traumatizing and sadistic to other people. In November 1996, the police are still considering arresting him for the whole thing with the clinic, the veterinary clinic, and a shelter, whatever it was. They were going to get him. I'm convinced they would have arrested it and convicted him. He knows this.
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, the evidence was building, and everybody they talked to was like, oh, yeah, he's certainly capable. It wasn't looking good.
Yeah.
So Rod Ferrell, a young man, another teenager named Howard Anderson, a young lady, Dana Cooper, and Charity Kessie, who was the girlfriend.
Shay was the other name.
Was that her other name?
Shay.
Yeah, you're right. Mm-hmm.
Now, was that her real name?
I think Shay was her real name, and Charity was started out as the player, the character name, and then she just kind of adopted it because she liked it better.
Okay. So we'll call her Charity, but it's important to know that she had a different name. So they climbed into Howard Anderson's Buick Skylark. I think Howard Anderson went by the name Scott, if I'm not mistaken.
It's a great car, the Skylark.
The Skylark. Whatever happened to the Buick Skylark?
Yeah, the same thing that happened to most of the other Buicks. Mm-hmm. They stopped making them for a while.
Yeah, so this is an interesting kind of mid-sized sedan, but they all piled in and drove to Eustis, Florida. Mm-hmm. Their mission was to save Heather Wendorf from her terrible parents.
From the hell that she lived in.
Yep.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll talk about Heather's culpability or lack of it. It's not clear what she knew at this point, but she did know they were coming to get her.
Yeah, she did. And she did end up going with them.
Mm-hmm.
But
more or less to run away is what it seemed.
Yeah.
She had intention at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that her intention was at the moment.
Right. They wanted to go to New Orleans and live as a vampire cult, clan, whatever.
because in 96, that was 2 years after Interview with the Vampire came out, which came out in 94.
And that was that set in New Orleans?
Set in New Orleans, yeah. But the majority of it was set in New Orleans, and there was part of it in Europe, but then they came back to New Orleans. And New Orleans has always had kind of that connection to supernatural stuff, like voodoo and hoodoo, and things have been cultural aspects of Louisiana for a long time, especially the Bayou culture. And vampires just became a natural part of that.
It really seemed to fit in with the movie. Like, that environment really seemed to work. Like, they were able to blend in pretty easily because there was a lot of unorthodox beliefs surrounding them. So, like, oh, I'm a vampire, whatever. Like, join the club. Whereas, they would struggle to fit in other areas, I guess. I don't know. I've never been a vampire, so I'm not exactly sure about their culture, but...
It's not too late. I mean, at that point, you've probably got another couple hundred years that you could just add on to your life.
I've never been an actual vampire. I just played one on TV. No, actually, around a table at a Denny's.
Just like a vampire.
Yeah, just like a vampire. Yeah. All night, though. We would get there like 11 p.m. and play until just before the sun came up, and then it was a race to get home.
Right, because sunlight's bad.
Right.
Sunlight is bad for vampires, yeah. It was just bad for me because it meant that I was up for 24 hours.
So we see here that Heather became an official vampire in Florida, and because she drank Ferrell's blood at a cemetery. This is something that was...
That was a ritual that they made up for that. In the game, a vampire would become a vampire by an extant vampire, an existing vampire would become the sire by draining this person completely of blood and basically killing them, and then giving some of their blood into this freshly minted corpse, or slightly before they're dead, they're fully dead, giving them some of this blood, and then they rise as a vampire.
So not a zombie.
Not a zombie.
There's got to be a fine line there between turning into a zombie and being a vampire still.
It's the power of the vampiric blood that makes it the vampire instead of zombie. Yeah. But it is the whole point is that the actual soul gets severed and goes on to whatever its final resting place is, but then a small portion of it gets stuck because of the vampiric blood, and they come back as a vampire, and then they have a lot to learn about how to be a vampire.
So the soul's gone.
In the type, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was another movie about vampires that was very popular. That was all shot entirely on a soundstage. Even the outside scenes. Bram Stoker's
Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah, Dracula. Right. Well, Dracula was a vampire. Yeah. A very famous.
Yes, arguably one of the most famous vampires.
Yeah, so I can't remember. I think he was like mad at God and like rejected God and then became a vampire and then infected other people. I don't really remember the movie. I remember there was a chase with a carriage, like a horse-drawn carriage at the end. It looked very fake on a soundstage. Like you could tell it was not.
There was a 92 with Gary Oldman, Winona Ryder.
Yep.
Anthony Hopkins as Van Helsing.
Great actor.
Yeah. And Keanu Reeves as Jonathan Harker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all-star cast.
It was very much an all-star cast.
There was a Mel Brooks movie that came out, 95, Dracula Dead and Loving It. Starred Leslie Nielsen.
That was a great movie.
So right around this time. It
was a great movie.
Yeah. And so, parody of, the classic vampire, Dracula type story. I'm trying to remember I'm trying to look now who was in it. There was some point, this might have been early YouTube, but it was free on YouTube. And I don't know that I would have ever really tried to rent it or anything at that point, but I was like, oh, great, it's free. And I remember watching it then. And, classic Mel Brooks, classic Leslie Nielsen, just goofy and, a lot of stupid humor and stuff like that. And you're right, it was great, like really good.
Yeah, who else was in that movie?
Peter
McNichol, Steven Weber.
Yeah.
Oh, Steven Weber's, he's hilarious.
Yeah.
He's got a very understated sense of humor. He's a really great straight man.
Yeah.
But he was amazing in Wings. I don't know if you remember Wings.
Yeah, Wings. I did not.
Wings was a
other than the band.
Wings was a show.
So Wings was a show with a couple pilots, their love interest, and I think a taxi cab driver, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems like a simple setup, but it was clever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was.
It was actually a good show.
Yeah, I liked it, and it kind of had a spin-off of Cheers.
Mm-hmm.
Early on, they spun off. It was set on the island of Nantucket.
So I guess I have to watch Cheers. It's just one of those things that was like, my parents probably watched it. It was probably, in my mind, I'm like, it's probably boring, but you guys talk about it enough. I guess I have to watch it now.
Yeah. Cheers is pretty good. And, Frasier came from that, as well, which I think was actually, in many ways, a better show, even though I really like Cheers. But Cheers was, like, controversial. Like, it pushed the boundary a little bit for certain social discussions. Not in a sophisticated way, kind of a crude way, but it did it.
Yeah.
And it also was cleverly written. It was a well-written show. Yeah. Woody Harrelson, I think, was one of the bartenders.
Yeah, he was, after, I think it was like the fourth or fifth season or something like that, one of the original actors who played Coach, he actually died in between filming, so they hired a new person to kind of fill in that role of like the vacant person. Like that was the thing. Coach was so old and had taken so many hits to the head that he kind of wasn't all there. Mm-hmm. Right. So he was kind of the funny man. Like somebody would say something like seriously straight to him and he would just like off the wall some random thing because he didn't hear it right or because he was like, what? Like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And they brought in Woody Harrelson who filled the same role, but only because he was so naive. Because he's from backwoods Indiana, and they just kind of exchanged like the one means of being completely vapid with another. And Woody was a great character. After that, it was so wonderful.
Yeah, it really worked.
I think that was Woody Harrelson's best character ever.
Probably, I liked him in Zombieland too. But yeah, developed character, I would say, would be Cheers. But he found a real, like Zombieland, he really found something funny, I think, in terms of that character. I've liked him in a few things. He's kind of a surprising actor.
He is a good actor, but I think that was one of his best roles, was Woody. Woody Harrelson played a character named Woody on the show.
Not too confusing. Yeah.
Not to confuse anybody. If you've never seen the show, there's Woody Harrelson played Woody.
I guess that makes it easy. Like, you don't have to remember another name on set, I guess.
So we see here the crew's in a Buick Skylark. They're in Florida. And they want to get to New Orleans, as we've discussed. And they want another vehicle. I guess something a little nicer. So they planned on stealing the dream vehicle, a light blue 1994 Ford Explorer.
Oh, I always wanted one of those. Had to be the 94. Mm-hmm. There aren't very many of them left.
No, as it turns out, Richard Wendorf, Heather's father, and Ruth, her mother, they owned this vehicle. So the plan was to steal this.
What? That's a coincidence. Like,
amazing.
It's the best vehicle they could have ever hoped for.
Sitting right in the driveway.
Sitting right in the driveway
yep.
of Heather's parents.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going there to rescue Heather's parents, or rather rescue Heather from her parents. They weren't rescuing her parents. They went to rescue her from her parents. They've got the perfect vehicle right there to steal.
And a future as vampires.
That could really like stick it to mom and dad. Mm-hmm. And they could go off and be vampires in New Orleans.
Yeah, so they were trying to live the dream.
What happened next, I think, was a little bit excessive.
Yeah. Well, and the question here becomes, and we can discuss this, what did Heather really know? There's varying reports, right? So at this point, one report said that Rod and Scott Howard, they were going to steal that vehicle, and that was it. Mm. Maybe rough the parents up for some money, something like that, but no fatalities. Other reports say that she knew what they were going to do, but that we'll talk about that. So we see that Rod Ferrell and Howard Anderson, they entered through the garage door. It was unlocked. Always important to lock your doors, right? They enter the garage. They found a crowbar in there. They go in, and this is a common scenario. I don't know. Maybe I'm just detached from what certain people do, but Richard was asleep on the couch. And this is a common scenario I've seen in many other crimes,
right,
where people enter. There's one in Connecticut that a family was murdered. Same thing happened. Intruders entered, and the guy was asleep on the couch. And they always say later, oh, that's just where they were sleeping at that point. It's like, okay. I'll take your word for it. But
why is this so common?
Yeah, why are you sleeping on the couch?
There was a controversial case. The Army doctor, McDonald, I think was his last name.
McDonald.
He was supposedly sleeping on the couch.
Yeah, what is it with that?
The thing is, I will sleep on the couch sometimes in my house. Like I have some acid reflux issues, and like if I'm laying down and I have some of those issues come up, I'll go out to the couch because I can prop pillows up behind me and be more comfortable, more upright position, and then get a little bit of sleep. So I'll do that. So it doesn't really strike me as super odd, but it is like a coincidence that like this happens so often in cases like this.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to expect the violent burglars if you're sleeping on the couch.
It makes me want to take all of the pillows and stuff into my bedroom so that I'm not sleeping on the couch. Somebody's going to murder me.
Set up a camera or something. Like if I'm on the couch sleeping, I know someone's bound to come in here.
I'll just run a string with tin cans on it between the walls, so that if anybody comes into the room, they trip over it and it wakes me up.
Do some real Home Alone stuff and set up a blowtorch and.
Problem is, my cats would set off that particular alarm. I would never sleep.
Yeah, so they did stumble upon Richard Wendorf on the couch, and they had a crowbar, and they actually beat him to death. He woke up just before he died, but they killed him pretty quickly, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. It was apparently a brutal scene. So then Ruth entered, and now Rod would claim that she threw a hot cup of coffee on him. He wasn't planning on killing her, but he beat her to death with a crowbar as well.
One of the things that I heard was that I read was that Howard Anderson, when they went in, they planned on it. They said, Rod said, "You take care of the mother, I'll take care of the father." And when Ruth came into I think she came out of the kitchen into the main room. Howard was standing there. He's kind of like deer in the headlights, kind of like, "Oh crap, what do I do?" And Rod said he wasn't intending on killing her at that point. They were just going to take some stuff and leave. Mm-hmm. But then, his claim is that she threw the hot coffee on him. And Howard Anderson would say that she did do that. Whether or not he was in the process of attacking her in that moment is still the contention. But she definitely threw the coffee on him. And Rod maintains that that's why he ended up killing her, just to get pissed off and because she hurt him with this incredibly hot coffee. And so he bludgeoned her with the crowbar too.
Yeah, I'm convinced Rod went in with the intent of killing anyone who was in the house, including the sister. She wasn't there, they talked about waiting for her. 17-year-old Jennifer.
Howard said he was done after that. Like he was not going to stay in that house anymore.
Rod had said in an interview that he was aware the whole time that he could leave at any point, right? That he knew what he was doing. He made the conscious choice to go in there, and I know I can just walk out at any point and they probably wouldn't even know I'm here because, right, the father was sleeping on the couch and he could just probably steal something and walk out and nobody would be any wiser. But that he felt a rush, right? That he knew what he was doing and it felt exhilarating and whatever else. And he didn't hide that, right? He didn't hide that he took joy out of it or pleasure or, that rush feeling. And that's scary, right? To think that someone's in that moment and just so intentional about it and knew exactly what they were doing. I think he would say about the father too, that he didn't realize the crowbar wasn't sharp enough, was trying to stab him, in the heart or something along those lines. So yeah, it was very intentional, gruesome, and it was really playing out in his mind in a certain way.
Oh yeah, he definitely tried to stab him through the heart first. That's a classic vampire thing. The stake through the heart is in vampire mythos for hundreds of years, going back. So he was definitely trying to stake the father through the heart, but it's a crowbar. It's not a stab bar.
Right.
It's meant for prying boxes open, not like stabbing people through the chest. So he ended up beating him a lot in the head and in the ribs.
Yeah, it was a brutal attack, and as I understand it, Rod physically carried out the entire attack as Howard looked on. So this becomes important later as they consider the sentencing for these two. So they took jewelry and that Ford Explorer as well as a credit card, and they took off. As it turns out, Jennifer was at Publix working, and she stopped at her boyfriend's apartment, I think it was, or she would have ended up at the house during the attack.
Yeah.
Now, this is interesting. So it's very clear, no question, that Jennifer had nothing to do with this crime. We know that for a fact. Later, everyone else, or the two offenders directly involved would be convicted, as well as two others. Jennifer was not involved.
And she wasn't even really considered as a suspect.
Never. She was never a suspect.
Which is odd because she discovered the bodies and called it in.
Yeah, that's my point.
Investigators usually, that's one of the first places to start, right?
So I think
look at the person who discovered the bodies first.
I think this is fascinating because the 911 call, the transcript's available. And when you read it, you don't know. Like, again, we know that she's innocent. She had nothing to do with it. But if it was unsolved, people would have thought she did it. Because she acted in a way I didn't think was too unusual, but I've looked at a lot of true crime. But to somebody looking at this, like not knowing human behavior, they would say she was way too calm. Mm-hmm. She said details that didn't make sense at the time. She seemed to be worried about other things. She didn't act right. Like, I'm convinced that in people's minds, they would have convicted her based on that call. And again, she literally just came home and found the body. She didn't even go near them. And that's one of the things, you see in the call, like the dispatcher's like, we want to try to render aid. I'm paraphrasing this, but, and she's like, I don't want to go near the bodies, which is, if they're dead.
And even worse if they're not dead and you've got to, you're seeing your parents and they're very bloody and beaten and, I'm going to try and render aid. What if while I'm doing that, they die?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can understand her hesitation in wanting to do that, but the Rod and Howard didn't do anything to cover up anything. So as soon as investigators were on the scene, it became obvious.
They knew she was not involved.
Yeah, they knew she wasn't involved in it at all, immediately.
Yeah, but that's a great. I think reading that 911 call is a great example of how people do always seem unusual when they call 911. You can always find something where, why was she seemingly so calm? I don't think she was calm. I think she was scared to death.
So, barring certain people in Florida, most people don't call 911 repeatedly. Unlike the Florida woman who called 911 because people wouldn't kiss her at a coffee bar, and then like when they showed up, cops showed up to arrest her for misusing 911. She jumped up on a table, started dancing and screaming about how people should take off their masks. Weirdness.
I mean, it makes sense to me, right?
But I
do that dance all the time.
Yeah. I don't doubt that, Jeff. I really don't. To me, I can't remember the last time I called 911. I don't think I ever have. So, I mean, it's an unusual experience to have to do that. And if you're calling 911, it's probably because there's an unusual something happening. Mm-hmm. And if it's two dead parents, that's incredibly unusual.
So it's
unless
interesting.
You're Batman.
That's interesting. You think you may have never called, never called 911 in your life. How about you, Jeff?
Yeah. The old neighborhood where I used to live, I was the president of the Civic Association, and people were constantly calling me and being like, hey, this thing's happening or this or whatever. And it was a lot of just diffusing, like, okay, well, they're allowed to drive their car on the street because it's a street and it's, they're not in your driveway or whatever. So usually it's just a non-emergency, like there was something that happened or whatever, So I was able to, and most people don't recognize that there's like a non-emergency number. And I don't know if that's everywhere, but in Delaware there is for each county. And so, you're able to recognize like, okay, some things you might need police, but you don't need them right now. It's not an emergency. But other things, it is an emergency, and you do need someone to come right now. So yeah, I've definitely made some calls, and it was really just surrounding that, just because people would constantly, they look to someone to lead and be like, I want you to make this call instead of me. I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't want to make this report, or whatever it was, But at the same time, it was a lot of frivolous things that were just kind of stupid, like, hey, this person's been hanging around in front of my house, like parked along the side of the street or something. And I'm really, I'm worried. What are they up to? What are they doing out there? And it's like, well, maybe they're just killing time, right? Maybe they just have somewhere to go and they can't go there yet for whatever reason. And at the end of the day, it's a public street, and that's a lot of what people do. They, especially if they've just got too much time, they just sit there and try to figure out what other people are doing outside of their house and get worried and paranoid. And so 911 can really be utilized in a lot of bad ways, right? And then that, of course, takes time away from these true emergencies. And there's a lot of things people try to read into, of course, as well. Like I heard a small clip from the 911 call, and she did sound calm. Didn't sound like she was just going totally out of her mind, which you would figure like, oh, maybe that's how I would react if I found my parents dead. But I don't know, right? Like you guys were saying, there's no precedent for it. People don't usually find other people dead and are not good at making that call because of that.
Yeah, I think she was terrified, but just kept it together.
Yeah.
And I think the dispatcher she had was pretty supportive.
Yeah.
I was kind of talking her through. But that was tough. I mean, she lost everything.
Mm-hmm. I did want to mention something that something you said reminded me, especially talking about 911 calls and calling 911, how people kind of often look for leadership in things and they're not comfortable with things. Just a public service announcement for everybody out there. If you ever find yourself in an emergency where you need 911, the movies show us people just going, somebody call 911. That is the worst thing to do because everybody surrounding in the area will assume that somebody else is going to do it.
Yeah.
If you look somebody dead in the eye and go, you, call 911 right now, they will. Mm-hmm. They'll take out their phone and call 911 because now it's their responsibility. Even if they don't want to have any part of it, they'll be like, okay, fine. Geez, you don't have to be like...
That's what they tell you in CPR classes.
Yeah, they tell you to do that in CPR classes. So if you haven't taken a CPR class and you didn't know that, now you know. And knowing's half the battle.
There you go. Public service announcement by Mike.
Public service announcement. G.I. Joe. I just had to say it. G.I. Joe.
Yeah, so I've actually called 911, I don't even know how many times, many times, dozens. Because at a clinic I supervised that for a long time, I was the one who did that when somebody had to be committed.
Yeah.
So you'd have to call the state and get permission, unless it was like a real emergency. And then you'd have to call 911 and say, I need to pick up a transport to the mental hospital. And they would come out. And sometimes, though, I called 911 first because the individual was dangerous. Mm-hmm. That happened a few times where it was get permission later, get the police on the way.
Yeah.
And when you would call, like, they could pretty much tell if you're excited or not. So most of the time I would call them like, all right, look, I'm at this clinic. I need a transport. Person's not dangerous. Other times I would call them like, I really need you guys now. And they would send like, 3 or 4 cops when that happened. They would be like, it was like, felt like before I hung up the phone. Like you turn up like, oh, they're at the door. Although, well, it didn't feel like that. Actually, it felt like it took a long time, but it was very fast. They would get here pretty quick. But other times, if it was an emergency, especially like on split shifts, like Christmas time, when they're doing 4 hours instead of 8, you sit there for 6 hours waiting. You run out of things to talk about in 6 hours with the client.
Yeah.
So you're going to the hospital.
How's that? How's that for you?
You ever had that hospital food? I mean, depending on the unit, can be better, it could be worse.
Actually, that was a topic we would talk about often. was the quality of the food at the different hospitals you could get committed to? Like, it was a difference. It was a significant difference at the time.
Only thing I've ever, because I've never had to call the police on that, but I have had to advise people about, hey, going to a hospital, going to one of the local mental health hospitals for crisis intervention, and I've had to have that conversation of, you should go willingly, right? Willingly is better, like all around, because in Delaware, at least, I'm not sure about other states, but in Delaware, if you are involuntarily committed and have to go through an involuntary, you lose all sorts of rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's much better to go voluntarily. Yeah, it becomes problematic for like gun ownership and other rights can get compromised, and it almost becomes a criminal record. Yeah. Honestly, I think that's what they mean it to be kind of punitive. Whereas if you go voluntarily, you can sometimes beat that system.
Yeah. And very often, if it's voluntary, like you can even leave against medical advice afterwards, and they can't stop you. If it's involuntarily, they will keep you there.
Yeah.
For the entire 7 days that they can.
The thing is, in some of the hospitals, voluntary seems a lot like involuntary because like the doors lock, and when they if they try to walk out, no one is there. Like they're not real attentive to it. So it's weird. Mental hospitals are a lot like prisons in some ways. In most ways, I would say, actually.
Not really sure what to do with these people.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot that can be done, but do we have the resources? Do we have the time? Do we have the people? Probably not. And yeah, it becomes a kind of a holding place for a lot of people, probably.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, and I'm not talking about any particular place here, but those type of inpatient facilities don't attract top talent in terms of counselors. And when they do, those people burn out.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a rapid turnover.
Yeah. So like you come in there and you're like, I'm going to do a good job. Sure. You keep that energy up for a while. See it works out. It's very hard.
Crisis intervention is incredibly, incredibly hard because it's a much rapid turnover and it's a short period of time. You have at most like 7 days with a person to make sure that they're stabilized and that they're able to go back into the world. There's no doing, real good deep work. It's just like, okay, are you stable? Out the door.
Right.
And that's all you're doing. I thought that working in inpatient rehab where I only have 28 days with somebody was fast. The amount of clients I had in 2 years was like 350. That a person working in one of our inpatient facilities for crisis management might have 350 in a month.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah,
that's insane.
It's not like counseling, like counselors think of, like what they want to do with their career. It's not like that. It's crisis management. It's putting out fires, not people leaving and like you're not walking out the person with your arm around their shoulder saying, a whole great life is ahead of you, and we're glad we fixed you in 7 days or 3 days. It's not like that. It's
sometimes it's I've got names for counselors. Call them.
Yeah.
But you're stable. You're okay. You're not going to kill yourself tomorrow. Go back out into the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a tough business. Yeah. But yeah, I've been on the phone with the dispatchers many times for for that.
But Jennifer, apparently, I would assume that she hadn't had too many opportunities to call 911
Probably
prior
never.
to that.
Yeah, probably never. And I think she actually did a good job communicating the facts and answering the question. I mean, the questions she was being asked. I mean, there was a concern, obviously, that the person was still in the house,
Yeah.
which is terrifying.
Yeah. But yet she held it together.
Yeah. Yeah, she did. Now, her sister, of course, was with this gang, the vampire gang cult, and the other 4 of them were now in the Explorer. So again, kind of thinking about what that means in terms of what did she know. You're in the vehicle, right? Like that your parents owned. It's hard to believe she didn't know. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people got stuck, specifically with Heather in Florida, like the state of Florida. Eventually, the grand jury failed to indict her twice.
And so there just was no evidence that she knew anything beforehand. Even if she figured it out when they were driving in the Explorer, oh God, they killed my parents.
Right.
She didn't have anything to do with the planning. She didn't have anything to do with the implementing, carrying out. Like for what she knew and what the evidence it was able to show, she just knew they were coming down to pick her up, and she was going to run away.
Yeah, I think where people get stuck is like, when are you an accessory? Maybe not to the murder, but to the armed robbery of the vehicle. The grand theft auto, whatever it would be in Florida. I mean, she was in their vehicle. She knew that she didn't have permission to be there. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, I think the grand jury made the right decision based on what's available. You can't help but think they're like, she lost her parents. We're not going to jam her up on a small charge. There's
also, at a certain point, the idea of lessened culpability through just the violence and the potential violence from the people she was around. Mm-hmm. And they're pretending to be vampires or predators. Rod might even have actually thought he was. And if she realized it, she realized it while it was happening, oh God, they're killing my parents. How do you exit that situation?
Right. She was stuck, and she was very young.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think they made the right call, but a lot of people in Florida would disagree with me. That was not a popular decision by the grand jury.
But that was the decision of the grand jury. So
yeah, and my understanding is she went to school in like North Carolina or something. Like she went all through her life.
She did. She changed her name when she went to North Carolina to Zoe Hawk.
Yeah, okay. I did not know that.
Spelled with an X.
Okay.
Xoey.
Okay.
Zoe Hawk. And she ended up getting married. Like she went to an art school, ended up getting married.
Would it be Exoe at that point?
No, it's kind of like Xander.
Okay.
I don't think it's like Professor Xavier of the X-Men. It'd be more like Xander, Zoe.
Okay. All right. More power to her, I guess.
Well, I guess you have a chance to pick a new name. You go big. Yeah. Right. Apparently, she is estranged from her family, though, and my guess is, I have no idea, but I would guess that it was the whole murder part. Even though she didn't know until it was over, just being associated with the people who did that. Little tension at holiday parties and such, right?
Not this murder part, the part where people got murdered.
Right. That's right.
The part where she was associated with the people who killed her family members.
Yeah.
It's got to be an awkward conversation at family gatherings, Yeah. Really can't really find much else to talk about. So, remember that one time?
Remember that one time the guy that I kind of liked for a little while came down and murdered my parents?
Remember that? You guys remember? Yeah, you do? Okay. All right.
Apparently, though, much more recently, I think within the last 5 or 10 years, she actually was able to reconcile with some of her family because of a funeral that happened. Like one of her grandparents died, and she was able to request, hey, can I come to the funeral? And yeah, there were some people who still had some hard feelings, but for the most part, it was a reunion. And
yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, she would be out of prison now based on the sentences of the other 2 teenage girls, or well, I don't know if one was over 18, but the 2 other offenders, female offenders, she probably would have been out anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah.
So
they were driving around in the Explorer.
They made it to not to New Orleans. They made it to Baton Rouge.
Yeah, they went through 4 states. Mm-hmm. Drove through 4 states.
And it was clear who did it right away. Like the police knew. They knew that, the gang of 5, 4, depending how you think about it, but 5 were in the vehicle. And they were after them. And it turns out that it was Charity who called a relative. Some reports say grandmother, others say mother. And that person assisted the police in setting up a meeting at Howard Johnson's. So there you go.
Howard Johnson.
You could have been there, Mike. You could have been part of solving this.
I could have been.
If only.
Sad.
If only.
I'm sad about that. Just tears.
So they went there and they were arrested.
Charity called because they needed money.
Yeah.
Right.
Like they'd run the credit card out and they hadn't been able to get much for pawning the jewelry, and they still needed more money and just to make it to New Orleans. Mm-hmm. So she trying to get some money, and her grandmother called the police. told them where she was, and they set up a fake meeting at the Howard Johnson.
Yeah, so their experience at Howard Johnson's was not nice, not positive.
No, yeah. Arguably, it was positive for everyone else.
Yes.
The outcome, especially since nothing violent happened. They were taken into custody pretty quickly and without incident.
I'm sure they left a bad review, though.
1 star, probably.
Yeah.
Probably a 1-star review.
Yeah.
Probably really led to the decline of Howard Johnson.
Rod probably used his 1 phone call to call in that review for the Howard Johnsons.
I just want to let you know I had a terrible time at your establishment.
Years later, he would get on a Yelp and be like, I remember when I was there in 96.
So they were all arrested, and Ferrell gave an interview, which is a terrible idea pre-trial. He said he suffered from special blackouts, where he'd have no memory of just certain things that he didn't want to basically confess to, I guess. He also mentioned how there was a rival vampire cult. I think that guy who beat him up back in Kentucky was the leader of it, ostensibly, and that that's why, or they committed the murders, rather. The other cult committed the murders. He was innocent. He also said he didn't want to be a vampire anymore. Strong statement.
Convenient.
Yeah.
By the time he went to trial, he'd changed back to, I am a vampire.
Yeah, he was a vampire by then. He also said he had multiple personalities, which usually means somebody saw too many movies. Right.
He definitely was dancing around trying to deflect blame off of himself. Not very well. And, police and prosecutors weren't buying it for a second. And the jury ultimately didn't buy it either. But I always remember one of the classic images of Rod Ferrell was from the court. He was playing it up for the cameras. And as they're leading him away in his shackles, in his orange jumpsuit, he looks at the camera and leans over, and there's a big plexiglass divider between leading up to the hallway, and he just leans over and kisses the plexiglass like he's kissing the camera. Mm-hmm. And that's just that is the classic image of Rod Ferrell.
Yeah.
In from this, it's kind of just his the way he wanted to portray himself, so cavalier and just everybody loves me because I'm a vampire.
So confident in who he is and his abilities and his whatever else.
Yeah. So he actually was going to go to trial, and right before it was supposed to start, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony murder. Mm-hmm. So that's the death penalty. At least that's what he was sentenced to.
Yep.
He was the youngest person in the United States at that time to be on death row. I think he was 17, was it?
Yep. Mm-hmm. And he would be the youngest person to be sit on death row for many years until his death sentence was commuted down to life because he was a minor when he was sentenced to death. And an appeals court said, hey, we can't sentence a minor to death. So they commuted it down to life in prison.
Yeah, with no possibility of parole. Nope. So now Rod did try to help Howard. He said that essentially he didn't do anything. He didn't help in the actual murder.
Right.
I think it was half to insult him and half to help him.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think there was any intention of trying to help him at all. I think he was just he was useless, well, I did everything. Right. And to be honest, I think that's actually what happened.
Yeah.
I think Howard Anderson walked in going like, yeah, we're going to steal some stuff. And oh, we're going to murder the parents. Oh, God.
What was actually happening?
It's actually happening. Oh, geez. Oh, no, I can't do anything. And like I said, vapor lock, he just like could not do anything. And I think that Rod, when he was talking to the police about it, finally just like unloading everything, just goes, yeah, he was useless. Didn't do anything. Ultimately, he also got a life sentence because he was a primary involved. Like he entered the house.
Yeah. So some people, this always comes up in these cases. Like Anderson clearly was not a killer. Rod definitely was.
Yes.
And people might say, well, why wouldn't they just let Anderson go, or convict him of burglary, or something like that? And it's because of what they call the felony murder rule, which is I think a terrible rule, but I think it's largely necessary because there's concern that if two people commit a crime together, they're just going to implicate each other, and you're always going to be deadlocked. You're not going to know who did it, like who was the shooter. In pretty much every state, or I think the majority of states, it doesn't matter.
And the felony murder rule is if a death occurs during the commission of a felony crime, it is considered murder.
Right. Okay. For everybody involved.
For everybody involved. Even if it's a heart attack. Like if you go into a bank to rob a bank and the security guard drops dead of a heart attack, that's felony murder. Because the point is, like, felonies are generally considered crimes in which extreme harm or death can occur. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes no injury happens. There have been plenty of bank robbers who have gotten in and out without just like anyone knowing, right? Except for the teller who has to give all the money.
Sometimes they only have a note.
Right. They just have a note and they just go like, give me all the money, and they rob the bank. It's still a felony because there's a potential for things to go bad in that situation and for someone to get seriously injured or die, which is why they're felonies. And we get into like some things that are like, well, why is that a felony when nobody could have gotten hurt? Like embezzlement of like $50,000. It's a felony. Well, because if you steal $50,000 from somebody, they're going to be mad. And that could lead to some severe issues.
Yeah, typically with the way the felony murder rules apply, it has to be a violent felony. So it's like there have been cases where somebody was like cashed a bad check over $1,000 and something happened, and they're like, no, it has to be reasonably foreseeable that a death could occur. So there have been some exceptions, but it seems particularly harsh in some situations. Like imagine where somebody goes into a store and one person's the getaway driver, and they don't even know their criminal partner's armed.
Right.
They think they're just going to like do a cash register grab, like to just grab the cash and run, smash and grab. And they do. They have a knife, and they kill someone. Now the driver, life in prison or death penalty. I think it's lazy. I think it's intellectually lazy is my complaint about felony murder. And someday, I predict that in many areas it will change. It'll be modified. But there's not many cases that it applies to, so there's not like people writing their senators to.
In this particular case, I think some people would have been satisfied if he'd just been charged with the burglary. But there were a lot of others, especially in Florida, who were like, nope, throw them both on death row.
Felony murder.
Throw them both on death row. Oh, well, he didn't actually do anything. Okay, well, life in prison. He was part of it.
Yeah.
And the other two girls, Charity and Dana, would also be charged with crimes.
Yeah, it's worth noting that Anderson will get out of prison. He'll be eligible for release in 2031 at age 51. So he had 2 life sentences. He was able to successfully appeal and get that to 40 years, which is a lot of freight, but he was so young that with the good time, still 51. It's not bad considering
and I think he has a good chance at parole because like he has remorse for what happened.
He's sorry.
Like he is definitely sorry for what happened because he didn't want to. It was a big fantasy idea about doing this, and then the reality smashed him in the face very hard.
Yeah, he should have never.
My apologies. We're talking about somebody who just got beat with a crowbar. I'm talking about smashing the face. Like that's.
It's not intentional.
So not intentional, but yeah, he got a real big dose of reality, and he's very sorry for what happened.
Yeah, I would have been satisfied with 20 years for him. I didn't see that as a 40-year or a life in prison, but I think in Florida you have to serve 85% of your sentence. So I would have been happy with 85% of 20 years.
In 2019, Rod was at a hearing, and 39 years old at the time, and he would apologize as well. So started to show remorse, and he might have before that, I'm not sure, but definitely during that, started to show remorse, was identifying that, at the time he was like, getting a rush from things, but he realized now that it was stupid. I didn't know what I was doing. I had all these fantasies, whatever. And this was a very different side of him. And of course, he would even recognize this doesn't mean it's going to bring anybody back, right? But, I'm trying to do the right thing now. But the family, of course, didn't want to hear from him. They had no interest in hearing any of his stories, or they didn't believe that he was actually sincere or anything like that.
The judge didn't either.
Yeah, right. So, which is, that's reasonable, right? Somebody that commits a crime like this and maintains these a certain view for so long that he would even say that he welcomed death, and the electric chair was something that he kind of dreamed about, and very very dark, right? And who knows if they're true, but he maintained these dark fantasies even after committing these murders and being sentenced and knowing what was ahead of him.
For someone who is such a charismatic kid, became a leader amongst the 20 or so other kids, and convinced some of them to go in on ritual sacrifice of animals. Like this kid who is adept at playing a role-playing game, even this many years later, his words kind of ring hollow to a lot of people.
Yeah.
It would take a huge effort to demonstrate that he actually feels remorse for this, because he's a consummate actor. He even convinced himself for many years that what he was saying was true.
Yeah, I think it's also tough because he killed 2 people. So, maybe with 1, people would say, all right, 40 years. But when you kill 2, there's a sense that you should never get out, right? I think when you kill 1, there's a sense you should never get out. But he was 17, so you could say, all right, well, do the 40 years. They were going to do that for Anderson. Mm-hmm. So, the judge said he was irreparably corrupt in April of 2020 when his appeal was denied. So you mentioned the other 2, Dana Cooper, Charity Kessie, also controversial convictions. People very upset about this, felt like they were part of the conspiracy, so they should go down for felony murder, but they weren't there.
Yeah, they didn't go in.
Yeah.
They were charged with crimes because they knew about what was going on.
Yeah, 2 counts of being a principal to 3rd-degree murder, armed robbery, and burglary with a deadly weapon.
Yeah, is they knew but didn't say anything. Like if they were, I think they were left at a park or something nearby.
It was somebody else's house.
It was somebody else's house. They were there with.
That's what it was. Heather's. Was it Heather's boyfriend? She was saying goodbye to her boyfriend. She knew she was running away, and they went over there, and the others went over to the house.
If they had at that time, while they were at that house, if they had called the police and said, "Look, this is what's going down. We heard about this. Go stop them," they would have been in the clear. Mm-hmm. There would have been no culpability.
There probably would have been some charges for what they were doing, but they could have testified against and been offered probably immunity. Yeah.
But they didn't do anything. They knew that this was going to happen, and they didn't do anything, which is why they got charged with the charges that they got. Yeah,
principal to 3rd-degree murder, serious conviction. They pleaded guilty, both of them. Dana only sentenced to 17 and a half years. She was out October of 2011. And this occurred in 96 originally. Charity only received 10 and a half, and wow, people were not happy about that. She was released in March of 2006. Seems like very light sentence, and raises this question like, okay, again, felony murder, why such disparate sentences? But not physically being there, even though they planned it, really helped them.
And they were agreeing to testify against Rod Ferrell.
Yeah. It was unnecessary ultimately.
Because he pled guilty, it was unnecessary, but they still agreed to do it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why the prosecutors really push to get a lower sentence and a deal.
Now on the the defense side of things, right? They're at an uphill battle. Rod had already confessed to the murders and plead guilty to it. So to a certain extent, the defense would have to argue that Rod didn't necessarily know what he was doing, or he had other problems that would keep him from recognizing what he was doing, things like that. So some things that came up during the trial were that his maternal grandfather had molested him, and Rod's aunt would testify to that extent, that he had also molested her and Rod's mom. So trying to paint this picture of he had a lot of bad things happen to him, and look how his mom turned out. She was a bad influence in his life too. And I didn't really read this a lot of places. Maybe you guys have more information on this, but Rod would also, or it was also said, I don't know if it was said during the trial, but that Rod got very mad because Heather had said that her dad was molesting her or something like that, and he got very mad about it, but then would find out later she was lying. And that was kind of seen as a motive for the murder. Mm-hmm. Did you guys hear anything about that? Because I didn't read that anywhere else, and I couldn't really verify that it was true.
Yeah, I think I remember something to that effect, that she had told a much more compelling reason for him to kill, rather than they're just bad people.
Right.
It was something exigent, and he reacted to that. And of course, in addition, he had a learning disability, autism spectrum disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. So he had a lot of things he could bring up as far as impairment, to say that he couldn't process information. He understood right from wrong, and that's what would have finished him.
Yeah. Because it's because he knew that, hey, this gave me a thrill. Doing this thing that I knew was wrong gave me a thrill, and that's what got him. And I think ultimately that's why he pled guilty, because there was no defense.
Mm-mm. No, I don't think it would have mattered. Like in Florida, the mental health defense rarely flies. So I think he was being convicted. I would say, my opinion is, if you're facing life with no parole or death penalty, fight it out and try. You never know who's going to decompensate on the stand and say something exculpatory or whatever. You give it a shot, right? He didn't even try. I mean, it's good for the state that he didn't.
Yeah, and ultimately he didn't because he knew he did it.
Mm-hmm.
And
he was proud of it.
To a point, he was proud of it.
Yeah.
He'd taken human lives. He was a vampire. He took human lives. There's no reason to hide that. Mm-hmm. Because as one of the core themes of Vampire the Masquerade was that vampires are better than humans. One of the major political arguments that goes on in the game, in the lore, is whether or not the masquerade should be upheld. Because some of the vampires believe, hey, we're better than humans. We should be ruling them. They're our food. You don't see humans trying to blend in with cows. So we're better than them. And I think that's the kind of thing that Rod embraced was that kind of, which is a funny word because in vampire, that's the process of becoming a vampire, is called the embrace. Mm-hmm. But when he took on the whole mentality of the vampire, when he embraced that, he really took on that superiority role. It's one of the reasons why he kissed the glass, was to show that he didn't have a care because he was so superior. Mm. And that ultimately was why he pled guilty, because to say not guilty, to try and plead not guilty, would be to deny the ultimate thing that he did.
And now he has a lot of time to process what he did. It's conceivable that in prison, you have that time to sit there, and he's never getting out. And it's probably horrible for him in there in many ways. And I kind of wonder if at some point he doesn't mature a little bit and realize that, what he did, not that it's going to help him.
He may have already. What he said at his last hearing may have been real and heartfelt, but the fact that he's such a manipulator and such an actor, nobody can ever believe. Mm-hmm. Outside can ever believe that.
He said that he did reentry classes and empathy classes in prison, which is interesting. I mean, that's pretty cool, right? I'm glad that they offer things like that. And Rod said that was helpful for him, learning from whomever, however they presented these ideas. And he did it multiple times. And I believe that they said that he would even teach these classes at some point. Like that's how much he was getting into it. He got to the point of teaching it. So, I mean, that's an interesting thing, right? That they trusted him enough to teach these things, to tell other people these ideals or present this information. But you're right. I mean, how's that going to change the mind of the victim's family, the victim's daughters? So it's, I'm glad, I hope that he is getting rehabilitated and kind of in a different place in his life. But still, I mean, he did it. And he's paying the crime. He's paying the price for it now.
As much as I would like to see, empathy classes help change somebody, for someone as manipulative as that can be just learning another way to manipulate.
Yeah.
And then teaching a skill like empathy, because empathy is a skill, is not hard to be able to pretend, to be able to say, hey, I notice facial features and facial expressions, and that's what tells me how to do this. And you can do this too. This is an easy thing. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't show that he actually has remorse. Like I said, it'll take a lot for some people to be able to see that he has a lot of remorse. And I don't think that he's going to be able to do that. And it's academic at this point, because he's not getting out.
Now, Florida, as we've explored in previous cases, like Ronnie O'Neill, Florida, prison's punishment, not rehab. They say it. A few states is like, you know what? We're not really interested in what you do in there. You need to suffer. And that's what he needs to do. Yeah. As far as Florida is concerned, I'm surprised they even have the classes with their attitude toward justice. Now, they might soften that without life sentences. Like if somebody's doing a year, they might do something for him. But Florida's about punishment. Prison's to hurt you. That's the idea. So he's got a lot of hurting to go before his vampire journey is over.
Dr. Grande, you had mentioned the diagnoses that they talked about in the hearing. Are you guys aware of any anything that was brought up about the substances? So I'm wondering if anybody tried to make the case that any of his behavior was brought on by substances, like maybe it was just a substance-induced psychotic disorder.
He tried to say that, right? He tried to say that he loaded up on LSD before the crime.
Okay.
And was in a psychotic state or impaired state, I guess.
Yeah, but again, those are some of his early defenses, and he's a gut reaction of, I got to get out of here so I can get back to my journey. If I can convince them to let me go, that'll be fine. But when it became obvious that they weren't going to let him go, he's like, yeah, I did it. They weren't going to let him go. They were going to push forward with trial, and he was going to end up being convicted. And at that point, there's no point in denying it for him at that point anymore. But if he could convince the investigators of something, or the prosecutors of something that would let him walk out the door, he'd say anything.
I guess that'd be a pretty poor case for the defense as well, saying, "Oh, he's on substances." Well, he chose to be on substances, therefore he chose to, do something that was going to alter himself, etc. So maybe it's a much safer thing to go with the schizotypal, and now it's now he's got something wrong that he didn't choose, so to speak.
1996 would have been the worst time to try and say drugs made me do it, right? Because that was really at the height of the dare and the just say no movement. I mean, Nancy Reagan started. I've talked about it in other episodes. Nancy Reagan started in the early 80s, and the transitive property happened. Drugs are bad. People who do drugs are therefore bad people. Mm-hmm. He would have been seen as a bad person. Oh, I did LSD before I did this. Send him to the electric chair. Like, that would have been immediate.
Guilty.
Yeah, and under felony murder, for him, he was committing a felony when someone died. So even if he could say, well, I was impaired, so it couldn't be premeditated, doesn't matter. If you're committing a felony and somebody dies, it's felony murder.
Right, and there would have been multiple felonies because of LSD is felony. Like taking LSD, felony. Breaking into someone's home, felony. Killing someone, felony.
Yeah, he was down with felony murder no matter what. He was going down for it. I I don't think he had a chance of escaping life in prison. I'm glad that Anderson will have a chance to get out.
Yeah. I think he's definitely one of the people who just got a raw deal with the whole thing just because he got caught up in the wake of Rod Ferrell's, be it psychoses, overwhelming fantasies, his charisma. He just dragged Howard Anderson through with him. And ultimately, Howard was bought into the fantasies up to the point where reality hit. I think he was starting to feel, if I had to guess, because I wasn't there, if I had to guess, I would say that he was starting to feel like nervous. Oh my goodness, this is wrong, when they were breaking into the house. When it's suddenly the first blow rains down on Richard, it's, oh, F. Like, this is really happening. I want to go. But I think he was frozen in that moment. He couldn't, like, even if he'd run, he still, at that point, was still part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, he was stuck at that point. Once he entered, really even probably before that, they would have him for felony murder.
Right. If he hadn't entered but had stayed in the vehicle or had walked away while this was happening, because he didn't call the police, it would have been second or third for him as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this case really illustrates how you can get caught up in the wrong crowd, and the consequences could be the same for you no matter what your culpability. The justice system, again, intellectually lazy. They're not concerned with facts and things. Just paint everybody with the same brush. And I think that's important to know. Like public service announcement, don't get involved with the wrong crowd, because whatever the top offense is, you're now guilty of it.
Yeah.
So to wrap up this video on Ferrell, the last item that always comes up with this case is, was that a cult? Was the vampire clan really a vampire cult? Because the names are used interchangeably, but they don't mean the same thing. Right. Clan and cult. He identified, I think, as a clan, but other people say cult.
And that's a big thing in the game, is clans. Clans are different types of vampires, because there's different vampires throughout, different legends and myths of vampires throughout Europe and Africa, even into Asia and the Americas. So they split up different visions, different versions of vampires into what they called clans. Some of them were much more brutal. Some of them were the really Bela Lugosi kind of hoity-toity, upper-class, aristocratic portrayal
like Lestat.
Like Lestat. Others were kind of like more animalistic. And then one of my favorites was called the Nosferatu, which draws from the ancient word. They were very ugly. Like as soon as they were embraced and became a vampire, like whatever they looked like just devolved into something nasty. They tended to live in the sewers because they couldn't really blend in with other people.
I remember the show Futurama. They had the sewer people.
Yeah, the sewer people.
They were ugly.
Yeah. But this is like one of the first vampire films. Actually, is called Nosferatu, and it was based as a film version of Dracula, but they couldn't get the screen rights to Dracula because Bram Stoker's family wouldn't let it happen. It's a black and white movie. Has still are honestly one of the creepiest versions of the vampire that I've ever seen.
And a silent film too, which makes it more creepy.
Yeah. Very long, creepy fingers, long fingernails, like pointy ears, bald head. Like he's really just creepy. In that film, I think it was made in the early teens, like very, very old film. That's Nosferatu. Like that's what they look like. So these clans are just different types of vampires. There's actually a really great movie called Nosferatu that's more modern. Had who was in it? Had a bunch of big names, but the premise of that was that the vampire from the original, it was a behind the scenes documentary. Like it wasn't a documentary, but it was like the making of this movie. So most of the actors were playing the filmmaker and other actors and things, but the the person who played the Nosferatu, the vampire in their movie, was actually a vampire. And like they all thought he was like a method actor who wouldn't break character, but he was actually a vampire. It's kind of funny, but the movie itself is just creepy. Like it's meant to be kind of a dark comedy. But Willem Dafoe, I think, was the guy who played the
Great
Nosferatu,
actor.
and he is a great actor. He's a very creepy actor, so I believe that he played the thing. I could be wrong, but that was a good movie.
I'll have to check that out.
Was that 1979?
No, it
the one
was
you're talking
much
about?
more recent.
Okay.
Much more recent than that.
It's tough to find, like, because you look up Nosferatu and, like, you know, obviously you get things all the way back to the teens and the 1920s. And so it's tough to find, there's references to it, you know, all over literature and everything. So it's tough to find any kind of, it's tough to find what you're actually looking for. Yeah.
Yes, so there are clans, and that's something he would have learned from the game, right? So maybe that's why he chose Vampire Clan. What about the idea that he was really a cult leader?
So I think he was definitely very charismatic. He became very manipulative. But I don't necessarily think that there was much in the way of, because when I think cult, there's always tends to be religious aspect of it. And while there is some religious aspect to vampires and things, and the mythos, that's really built into the mythos. And I don't think that his followers were doing this from a religious standpoint. I think it was very much a manipulation of the counterculture need, the idea that they were separated out from society in some way, and then just kind of playing the game, pushing the boundaries of the game.
I think they were sensation seeking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so when you think about what I call the great cults, even though they're actually awful, but the notorious cults, you think of people like David Koresh. That was really about power and sex. Bhagwan Rajneesh, that was about Rolls Royces, sex and drugs and power, I think.
Money.
Yeah, actually, his goal was world domination, remember? He wanted to take over the whole world, make the whole world one of his communes. Yeah. Marshall Applewhite, I couldn't tell you. You know, it was one of the strangest cult leaders, the whole thing with the sneakers and the spaceship. Oh, yeah. And, of course, Jim Jones, ultimately, a lot of homicide. Mostly homicide, probably, and some people who brought an end to their own lives, but pressured by him. I don't really see Rod Ferrell as in that club.
No. Didn't have the intelligence, didn't have any kind of plan for what he was doing. He was just sensation-seeking, impulsive, and just wanted what he wanted, and hopefully everyone else was with him. And yeah, and he of course abused the power that he had, like we see with many leaders. But I think just to get what he wanted and didn't really care about the rest of it.
I think he was too impulsive too. Like he wasn't. A lot of the cult leaders tend to be very methodical. There's some impulsiveness in the things they do, like all of the Rolls Royces they're purchased, but that's and after the fact things, like they tend to have a lot of patience to build up their following, right? And I think that Rod was just collecting the disaffected youth that happened to be in the area, people who were looking for some sensation seeking, who wanted to have the fun, and who got drawn into the game. And then he just kind of manipulated them. And they became his followers in the game, primarily. But when he left to go down to Eustis, Florida, he only took 3 other people with him. Mm-hmm. Like he had like 20 or 30 followers. He could have, if it was a cult, like it would have been, let's all go.
Mm-hmm. Or a real cult, they would have gone for him.
Yeah, he would have said, go down there and bring her back. Mm-hmm. Oh, and kill her parents.
Yeah, I don't think he was really. I think he just basically formed a gang.
Yeah,
that just a primary purpose was to give people a sense of purpose. Teenagers and young people who probably had parents that were not good supervisors, and maybe trauma history, who knows what, but they were attracted to what, for whatever reason, to somebody who is normally considered an outcast. Mm-hmm.
I think because they were also considered outcasts. Mm-hmm. Get drawn to the biggest outcast.
It was the land of the unfit toys, right? So,
Shadow of the Vampire, by the way, is the name of the movie. It had John Malkovich as the vampire, Willem Dafoe as the director. Also had Cary Elwes in it, who's a great actor. He played in Princess Bride. Yeah,
and
he played Wesley.
and Kiss the Girls, was it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, with Morgan Freeman. Yeah.
And in several of the Saw movies as well, which is a great franchise. But yeah, Shadow of the Vampire. Fictionalized version of the filming of the movie Nosferatu from 1922.
Okay, nice.
Yeah. What year is it?
The Shadow of the Vampire was 2000.
Okay.
It's May 2000.
So I guess we've concluded that this was not really a cult. And I think we've highlighted the dangers of his behavior pretty well. Pretty scary case. Probably scarier than vampires in some ways. So, final thoughts on Rod Ferrell and his little club there.
Club. You were just talking about essentially wanting to fit in with something, right? Like being an outcast and finding other outcasts. And that's, for the counterculture, that's pretty vital, right? Is that you don't feel like you fit in with other things, or you see more value in this other way of living or other way of being. And that's what you associate with. That's what you come to the conclusion, this is the way I want to be. The way you dress, the way you talk, the music you listen to, the movies you watch, the people you associate with, etc. And so that you can see that in any given middle school or high school that you go to as well, right? You have different cliques and things like that. And so the ones who feel like they're outcasts, the ones who associate more with other things or don't fit in somewhere and then start to find that they have similar values to other people, you can see that anywhere, right? That's just how society works. And so Rod was able to find this with his group. And of course, they took it way too far, right? They fit in with something and started having a lot of weird rituals and things that they knew about, but then just took it too far. You could make a kind of a parallel with probably a lot of things, but one that came to mind as I was reading about Rod, the Columbine shooting happened a few years after this murder, 3 years after this murder, in 1999. Now, I know that it's very different, but when you look at the two shooters at Columbine, outcasts, they're into many different things, countercultural type things. The music they listened to, the way they dressed, the way they perceived people, the way they thought, all of that. And they had been planning the murder, the school shooting, I think for about a year or so before it actually happened. So during this time, just the 90s in general, and you could see kind of this pattern of people had other ideas. Some, of course, took it too far. We can see that with a lot of different examples. But these things where people felt like outcasts and they felt like they had to do something about it, right? So Rod and all of them, they joined this group, this clan, and felt like they needed to do something about it. They needed to do things that they wanted to do. They weren't going to stick with the norms. They wanted to, and the Columbine shooters, they felt like they were the outcasts and they had to take care of the other people who made fun of them, or the people who made them feel like outcasts, things like that. So it paints, it gives a bad image of people who may dress like that, trench coats and wearing all black and different hairstyles or different beliefs or different activities, you might do, which of course not everyone who wears black or a trench coat is a bad person, but they adopted ideas that would carry through with other things. And so it's a shame that when people feel like they don't belong places, that some people resort to these other ideas, violence and impulsive behavior and things that would come back to bite them, but things that at the time feel good to them. And they feel like, oh, I'm invincible. I can't do anything wrong. Nothing's going to come back to haunt me. But of course, it's not the case, right? And then they end up making bad decisions that would play out for the rest of their lives. In cases like Rod, he'll be in jail forever and will never get out. He'll never be able to experience any kind of freedom again because of stupid decisions he made that at the time he realized that he was doing something bad, but didn't care, right? So I guess the moral of the story is that help's always available, right? And when you realize you're doing something that might have consequences, maybe it's time to step back and realize maybe I need to scale it back a little bit. Maybe I need to do something different. Maybe I need to reach out to people that might be able to help, as opposed to continuing my current behavior, which can quickly spiral out of control. We've seen that in many different cases. So a very tragic end to something that could have just been people playing a game. There's millions of people out there that play similar games that never even go anywhere near this point. Could have just been playing a game and acting it out.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's ways to rebel without violence. They could have been different. They could have stuck together. They could have had fun. Maybe they got a little trouble, whatever. They didn't have to resort to violence. I mean, they were using drugs, drinking already. I mean, it's common. They could have done that. I don't recommend it, but it's a lot better than homicide. But yeah, there's pro-social ways to rebel in a sense. And they didn't discover that. And I think a big part of it was Rod's leadership. Mm-hmm. He seemed to be most comfortable with extreme violence and really kind of pulled them in. But very good. Your thoughts, Mike?
This case it bothered me for years. It really did. This was something that before I didn't learn about this case until after I started playing the game. And I started playing right about 2000. And I started getting into it, and we played the game, as I said before, sitting in Denny's, which is a restaurant, mostly closed down now. We would sit in Denny's. It was a 24-hour diner kind of thing. We could get refills on our sodas for free. And we could, if any of the servers were starting to look at us funny, like, why are you taking up space? We could pay our tips and then order some more fries or Moons Over Miami or something, which is the best thing they had. And most of what we did, we sat there in the booth and we rolled dice and we played out these characters in our imaginations. And we went through these adventures and storylines that were just ever evolving and changing, which was what I really enjoyed about it. I loved it. And then I heard about Rod Ferrell, and like that's the most extreme you can get out of this, and it offended me. I was like, how dare you take something that I love and pervert it this way? Mm-hmm. And it's so bad. In doing further research and in becoming a counselor in subsequent years, I still have a bit of that knee-jerk, how dare you reaction. But I also look at the exigent circumstances around it. It wasn't the game that caused any of this. It wasn't. It was him trying to use the game to change something, fill something in himself that wasn't there, and ultimately, the killing of the Wendorfs had nothing to do with the game. Mm. It's just something he happened to do prior to. But it still got labeled the vampire cult killings. Right. Like, it didn't have anything to do with the game. It didn't have anything to do with them thinking they were vampires. It had everything to do with the fact that Rod Ferrell wanted to kill somebody. And he wanted to be the White Knight, ultimately, for Heather, someone he cared deeply about. And that's what led it to it. In that way, it has nothing to do with vampires. It's nothing to do with Vampire the Masquerade. And, I've seen the until this story, the most extreme thing I saw somebody do in Vampire the Masquerade was the one time I tried LARPing, somebody jumped on my back and tried to bite me with fake plastic fangs. It didn't even break the skin. But as I said before, rule number 1 in LARPing is no hands-on. You don't touch. So when this young girl jumped on my back and tried to bite me, I was like, whoa, done. I'm done. I'm out. I didn't play the live action version again for a couple of decades. And then the next times I got into it, I had some fun with it, but it didn't last long. And I prefer tabletop stuff these days. And I don't play Vampire as much as I used to. Tend to typically play Dungeons and Dragons. But it's more because of the system and the people that I play with prefer that game.
Yeah, I guess there's something about the vampire thing that, like, you can pretend you are a vampire and maybe get into it a little more, like, not you, but like offenders. like Rod they can pretend, because people look like vampires. Like vampires don't look, they're not like a dragon. Yeah. It'd be hard to be like, hey, I'm a dragon. You can't see any evidence of that whatsoever, but just,
Because vampires look human in general,
right?
Unless they're Nosferatu. But they tend to look human. And I've seen a lot of people do live action stuff. And for the most part, when people do live action stuff, if they're going to be drinking blood, they take out like some red wine and pour it in a cup, or ketchup. I've seen that. Like pour, like, ketchup, drink my blood. And that's the extent of it. I think the people who are playing in Kentucky went above and beyond with that. The actual drinking of each other's blood was a ritual that they felt was compulsory, but it's not anywhere in the game. In fact, in the game it says don't do that. Like, there are health risks and issues with that. Don't do that.
Yeah, transmission of disease.
It's and some of those warnings were put in because of situations like this. And it's a shame that we have to have certain warnings like that on a game that is clearly fantasy.
Yeah, it appears like we need warnings on everything.
Yeah.
Right? Every time you don't see a warning, somebody's going to do something, and then it's another label gets added. It's amazing to me how people, I think there was a case, I haven't looked into it, but there was some, I guess it happens frequently in some areas, but there was a case, I want to say in New Zealand, where somebody went on a stabbing rampage with scissors. Was that New Zealand? And the stores now have locked up the scissors.
Oh, jeez.
Something like that. Yeah.
I literally earlier today, I saw a meme on Facebook that was like, it's an older dude in one picture. It said, hey, back in my day, we didn't have all these warnings on all these things. And the next picture is somebody much younger. He's like, your generation's the reason we have these warnings. It's like, in order for a warning to be put on something, somebody had to do something.
Yeah, it could just be one person.
Yeah, could be just one person. One of my favorite jokes is, I don't remember who told it. It was a stand-up comedian I saw years ago talking about kind of warnings on things. He said he noticed on the bottle of Windex, it says, do not spray into eyes. It's like, what genius thought it was a great idea to spray in their eyes? Oh, man, I need to clean my contact lenses off, but I don't have time to take them out. That's great. Ah!
Yeah.
Somebody had to do it.
Well, I think one thing that we see, and I think many societies do this, not just American society, is we tend to want to eradicate everything bad. So if there's one person who breaks the rule, everyone suffers because that foolish person. Mm-hmm. We don't really let things go like, oh, that just happened. There has to be a certainty to it, which I think is a big part of why we see like the vaccine hesitancy and all that. So it's fear, like lack of certainty. People want control. And they can't get it. So they start like taking alternative treatments and doing kind of unusual things. It's that definitiveness. You don't always get that with crime. Right? I mean, sometimes criminals find a way to do something we have not predicted, but that doesn't mean there's going to be a rampage and everyone's going to do that. Yeah. Yeah. So, I think eventually in stores, everything will be locked up.
Well, the stores will just be locked up.
You just have to go and ask for stuff.
Of course, the days of stores are numbered. Amazon is just going to take over everything.
Yeah.
Just if you need something, you pick up your phone. There just won't be stores anymore.
It's probably easier.
There's warehouses. Mm-hmm. Somebody at the front. Oh, I need that. All right, let me go have my people get it, and we'll bring it out to you. Yeah, or we'll ship it to you.
I'm surprised we haven't seen more of like the automated Amazon stores where you go in and just like it's hooked to a warehouse, and you just. Mm-hmm. Buy, pick what you want off of the thing, and all of a sudden it comes down a chute. There you go, and you walk out. Like, I think they tried one of those in New York, which actually was relatively successful. Either that or it failed miserably. I don't remember.
I think there's something cultural to walking in a store and touching items that's going to take maybe a generation or two to shift over.
Yeah,
it's something like tactile. Like I can. It's quality. It's heavy. I should buy this.
And to a point, there are always going to be some stores. There are always going to be something like you can't really shop antiques on Amazon. You can't go antiquing. Things like the last minute need for a greeting card I can't get that off of Amazon because I have to have it in 5 minutes. But I can stop at the Hallmark store and pick that up, or I can stop at the drugstore, the pharmacy, pick one up.
I think it's also something to do. I think that stores have become like a trip that's fun because you can see things you would not have thought you necessarily want to buy. You can like browse different items. You can also do that on Amazon, and they recommend things quite vigorously that often do match what I want, actually.
Very vigorously. Sometimes, though, they're recommending things I've already bought.
Buy more.
It's like, hey, look, I need to buy a strip of LEDs for making a sign for my dad. I need to buy this strip of LEDs. Now, every time I open up Amazon, you strip of LEDs?
Need more?
You need this one? You need this one? Like, no, I got what I need. I don't need any more.
That's probably why malls are still thriving, at least here in Delaware, because it's a destination, right? It's something to do, and I hate going to the mall personally. I can't stand anything about it.
It's people everywhere.
But my wife and her mom, they love going. Like, they just walk around, maybe not even buy anything, but they just love going there.
The major benefit to the mall in Delaware is that it is in Delaware. I think that's what keeps Christiana Mall. It's what the name of our local mall is, Christiana Mall. It's what keeps it operational, especially in the 50% of the buying season starting November 1st, the whole Christmas season. That's 50% of the retail market, is because we don't have sales tax here in Delaware.
Yeah.
So people come from all over. There have been people who've driven here from Texas because they know they can buy their stuff tax-free.
They probably spent way more money than the tax would have been.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But, and they also have like, oh, yeah, we have family in the area, but we come up here to go to the mall.
Yeah.
But people come from hundreds of miles away just to come to Christiana Mall because they can buy without tax. And when you're buying some expensive stuff, tax racks up. So 5% on a $5,000 purchase.
Yeah, in some states around here, 6% tax. Like it can get. I think other states.
6.
Yeah. It's substantial. Yeah. So I think it's just an experience. I think also around the holidays, there's something special about going to the mall because it's decorated, and everyone else is like, in theory, happy.
I'll go around the mall to during the year to get stuff. I'd like to go to the movie theater. I just went this past weekend to the movie theater over there, which is great. I'll go over there to go like on special occasions to the Cheesecake Factory because it's great. That's a great restaurant. But once it hits November 1st, I do not go near the mall.
The traffic.
The traffic is horrendous.
Yeah.
Awful. Terrible. And you cannot find a parking spot.
I've been on 95 before where you look over, you can see a good portion of the parking lots.
Right.
And, it's a distance and my vision isn't great, but there's been times where I can't see a single spot, like around Christmas. Like, I'm like, what?
And the parking lot's huge.
Yeah, it's massive.
Or you can see the traffic piling out on the 95, trying to get into the mall.
Yeah. And you wonder why they don't just use Amazon. I'm a big fan of Amazon.
I am too.
So
I'm not a big fan of some of the political stuff going on with Amazon or
Right.
the payment stuff. I love using Amazon to buy things.
yeah, I even have the Prime thing.
Yeah,
It's
I got
great.
Prime too. I love Prime.
You hit the button and your doorbell rings. And there's a guy like, here you go.
Wow,
I've been waiting for a minute.
I just ordered this. No, this is the thing you haven't ordered yet. Like, oh, right, I got to order that.
I anticipated that you're probably going to want this. And if you don't, you will.
You want this strip of LEDs?
We know your other one must have failed by now.
No, I don't. Whatever. Give me the LEDs.
All right. So, interesting story of Rod Ferrell. One of the more unusual cases that we've seen. It's why, it was selected. A lot of lessons we've talked about that can be learned from this case. I think that, among the lessons, if somebody's misbehaving, try to stay away from them. Right? Just avoid it. There can be people that are destructive in your life. Just try to avoid them.
Stick to playing at the tabletop. Don't go LARPing.
There you go. So we'll wrap it up there with the case of Rod Ferrell. Please put any thoughts about this case in the comments section, or if you have ideas for other videos. We're always interested. We always read the comments. We certainly appreciate it.
Also, for this particular episode, I'm considering doing just a pair of vampire teeth or a Nosferatu standing. So put your vote in the comments.
There you go.
Let me know which one should I do, and at some future point, the winner will appear on the desk here.
Audience participation.
Yeah,
That's good. That's good.
Very good. Yep. So we'll look forward to your thoughts there. We will be back shortly with another episode of The Murder Part. Thank you so much.